Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we are here doing a brand new discography breakdown. We are going to be covering the discography of someone we've never formally covered on the show, who is still releasing albums, which is a definite first for us. We are going to be talking about the discography of one Miss Lana Del Rey, to the newest album, There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Boulevard. So we have enlisted a guest to help us, a chronicler of Miss Lana Del Rey's career, super fan of Lana, friend of the show, Coffee. And Riley, why don't we talk about what our thinking was doing this in the first place? Because I know that we have gone on record, and I think it's fair to say that maybe we have been slightly uncharitable to Miss Beth Grant in the past.
I don't know if she'd like you calling her that. So the impetus behind this was basically Jake and I were talking about, we wanted to do another full discography video. And we wanted to kind of challenge ourselves a little bit by not just doing another one of these videos on an artist that's canonically, that we're hugely into, that we've talked about before. Wanted to kind of step a little bit outside of our comfort zone. And what initially attracted me to the idea of doing Lana with Jake was the fact that I was kind of like, I enjoyed Lana. I really liked and respected Lana as an artist. I struggled a lot with her records. Jake, I think, was much even further to the, didn't really know what Lana was all about really, or how to really engage with her as an
I've
artist.
gone on record saying Norman fucking Rockwell is mid many times on this show, and stay posted for that opinion. Might have changed, but
you had a moment with that record, which we'll get to very in good time. But so basically, there was this dynamic of where neither of us are hugely into Lana, but there is like, I'm a little bit more into her than Jake. So it was like, I thought some good conversation would come out of that. And then of course, the idea of incorporating a third person who is actually an active Lana fan, like hasn't just been kind of, trying to understand her for the purposes of doing this conversation, but actually is coming into this with a perspective of being someone who is actually has been hugely into her music for a while and can speak to the appeal of it in a more direct way. That kind of made the idea, I think, coalesce into something that felt like it would be a really, really interesting exercise. So here we are. We're here to talk about Lana's music from the perspective of people who are coming at this with different levels of connection to her. Essentially, we're not just three Lana stans who are going to, basically talk about how she's mother for 4 hours and nothing else, right? We're going to actually approach this, and, we're not necessarily going to agree on our overarching opinions on each of these records. We're not necessarily going to agree on what works and what doesn't work, but we are going to, in the process, hopefully discover something about Lana that can unite us and can kind of help us to understand better essentially where we fall with this somewhat divisive, she calls herself divisive on one song, artist who is nonetheless one of the most important and influential artists of the entire 2010s, and still is making waves with basically each record that she puts out being this kind of cultural kind of moment, essentially. And that was the other impetus behind doing this as well, is the fact that she just released a new album. Did you know that there is a tunnel under Ocean Blvd? It took me a second to remember what it was called. And we didn't have a space to formally review it on our main show. And I thought, okay, well, why don't we just this kind of gives us a good reason to speed up the Lana thing and gives us a note to end on that I think will make it more relevant and appropriate for the current moment. So that all said, let's talk about Lana. Let's talk about Lana Del Rey. We're not actually going to talk about every record that Lana put out, because her debut record, aka Lana Del Rey, I think is what it's called, it's an interesting sort of look at how her songwriting was developing in the early stages of her career. But it is, for one, it's a very difficult record to actually find. It isn't, I don't think, officially released anywhere, although it is, you can track it down fairly easily if you know where to look. And it isn't necessarily a very interesting part of the arc of Lana's career. So we're kind of going to skip over that a little bit and just talk about her major label albums, her discography proper. So I think maybe the most important place to start, because this is the thing, there was a particular song that Lana released that essentially marked her beginning into the world of pop culture, essentially, and the beginning of the conversation around Lana Del Rey, the conversation that's continued for essentially 12 years straight, which is the release of the song Video Games in the summer of 2011. Lana's debut single, a pretty big moment as well, and a song that was pretty instantly canonized and captivated a lot of people and announced the presence of this really fascinating and really interesting artist. That then was followed within 6 months with her formal major label debut, Born to Die, one of the biggest pop records of the 2010s, an album that, you know, whether or not you were interested in it, in Lana or in music in general in the first place, was kind of inescapable and remains Lana's commercial peak and probably the peak of her like pop culture relevance, even though she's continued to be relevant in culture more broadly, basically as long as she's been making music. But before we even get into that as well, I want to throw over to our guest, Coffee, and I want to hear about, first of all, how long have you been a fan of Lana? How did you sort of initially get into Lana's music? And if you want to segue into your thoughts on Lana's debut.
Okay, so it's gonna sound a bit cliche, but it was around 2017 where I met and started going out with my first girlfriend, and she was
Tale as old as time.
yeah, she was, and this was like right before Lust for Life came out, so she was like kind of in like a middle of a Lana craze herself, very Tumblr girl, 2010s, you know. I'm you know the type, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I got stories.
And I'm sure anybody knows how, you know, when you start dating someone that you really like and they like something that you're not necessarily familiar with, you know, you start getting into it, you know. So Lust for Life was kind of tainted for me for a while after we broke up, but but then I was like, you know what, I kind of like her music. I remember listening to Video Games and Ultraviolence, you know, back when those came out, even though I was super young. But you know, and then Norman fucking Rockwell came out, and I was like, I mean, I'll get into it later, obviously, but that like really cemented me as like ride or die for her. That being said, I do own her first record on vinyl.
Ooh.
It's interesting to look back on that album now as like a cultural capsule, because I don't think you can, if like say you were 15, 16 listening to that album for the first time now, I don't think you could ever, or I don't think you could really fully understand the context in which it was released and the context in which people responded to it. You know, with the SNL performance where she like kind of totally bombed, with how it sounded nothing like any other pop music that was being released. And because like if you listen to it now, it sounds like so many other things. But back then, nothing sounded like Video Games. Nothing sounded like Blue Jeans, you know, whatever the fuck. And I like that album both as a look back into where she was starting, where her aesthetics, so it were beginning, but where pop music was, where pop music was going, because you know she would go on to influence people like Lorde, Billie Eilish, who in their own way would start their own waves. In so many ways, you know, I don't think where we are in pop right now exists without her.
Well, it's really interesting for me. I was not a Lana fan when this came out, but I was absolutely very consciously aware of her. I mean, Coffee, you're a little bit younger than Jake and I am, so that influences kind of your introduction. But when this album came out, I think when this album came out, I was just about to turn 15. And so this was a very sort of specific age and a very specific juncture in my life where I was that Tumblr kid. Like I was that kid, you know, not all of my, but most of my friends in high school were girls. And I was immersed in a lot of, and I was this, you know, weird introverted queer kid as well, who hadn't quite figured out that I was queer and hadn't quite kind of figured anything out really. And was just in this incredibly kind of unformed state basically, and I was completely, you know, my whole personality was based around sort of the music that I liked, the movies that I liked, the culture that I was into, right? And there was this like being a hipster kid in 2012 2013 as well, growing up on like Pitchfork core and being kind of conduced to view pop music through a very specific lens. This stuff over here is okay and allowed, this stuff over here is cringe, right? And Lana Del Rey in that early era fell squarely into the cringe category, with some exceptions, right? Like there was this idea that, you know, what Lana Del Rey was uncool, was kind of embarrassing, was kind of like representing this sort of unformed, sort of immature view of the world. And I didn't realize at the time how much of my perception of Lana through that lens was influenced by a lot of kind of institutional misogyny and sexism, in particular ways in which female artists are viewed, particularly in terms of how they conduct themselves and the kind of sort of characters and artistic personalities they build, and the nature of Lana's artistic personality and how what people think of it and how kind of culturally cachet it is something that continues to be relevant throughout her entire career. But in this particular era, the idea of this kind of fatalistic, deeply emotional, but also kind of deeply embarrassing and immature, but just completely in love with all of that immaturity, this particular whole thing that Lana had. Now, I was being conditioned by so much of the culture that I was surrounded by that this was not okay. This was not allowed. And yet at the same time, I was this massive emo kid. Like, I was into so many emo bands. I was into Sunny Day Real Estate. I was into American football. I was into like a lot of kind of what was coming into be third wave emo at that time as well. And that was all the same kind of shit, except it was okay because it was masculine. It was because it was kind of conducted in this way. And so my understanding of that disconnect was a huge part of me coming to allow myself to enjoy Born to Die and to appreciate what Lana's doing with this specific record in particular. And in terms of its kind of cultural place and in the arc of Lana's discography, I actually think it's kind of an outlier. Like, it's really, I would say, the only, well, not the only, but like, it's not the only pop record that she's made, but it's kind of the only like big commercial pop record that she's made. Like, the way she uses the landscape and the sounds of pop music and she wields those aesthetics on later records that we'll talk about, she does them in kind of purely artistic ways. I guess that's a kind of a loaded descriptor, but she never really shoots later in her career to make hits the way that this record seems as though it's packaged to do. And the songs on this record were enormous. They were inescapable. And Video Games was kind of my way in. Right, because first of all, it was a song that all the hipsters like. It was the song that Pitchfork gave best new track. It was the song that, you know, everyone was allowed to like for whatever reason, but they weren't allowed to like Summertime Sadness or Born to Die the song or Off to the Races or Blue Jeans or any of those tracks. So that was a kind of way in as well. And it is a kind of good way of setting yourself into the record as well, because it is this almost discomforting intimacy, this kind of revelation of what it's like to be in love and what it's like to kind of be in love with the idea of romanticism and the idea of tragedy and the idea of viewing your life through the most dramatic arc possible. And it kind of crystallizes and captures the sense of intimacy and connection and kind of completion that can come out of allowing yourself to sort of be, or to view your life, or to submit yourself to those kinds of narratives and relationships and that kind of way of viewing yourself and that kind of way of living, right? And it is very appealing to a younger audience as well, because it strikes a chord with the idealism of the way you want to see your life and the kind of ways you want to engage in relationships before you have a really, you know, proper understanding of what they're actually all about, and the way you want, you know, the way your way of dealing with your own emotions is so not fully formed yet that the unkempt romanticism and messiness of the way that Lana views her relationship to love and affection and boys and that kind of thing appeals to you, because it resonates with this idea of the immediacy of love and how it feels. That's a lot of hogwash, but there's something in there, I think, that's get to the heart of why that song appeals. Jake, I want to throw to you at this point as well, because you didn't have this, you know, cultural immersion and connection to this particular stage of Lana that I had, or at least if you did, it was different to how I experienced it. But I want to hear from you specifically. What was your knowledge?
It was very different.
Yeah. What's your relationship with this record been like, and how are you kind of sitting with it now?
Well, I think that doing this like episode was an interesting prospect, just because I never had like a fully fixed opinion on Lana or who she was or what she did. And a lot of that comes from context. I grew up in Kentucky. I went to a private Catholic school. So this shit that you guys are talking about, this is stuff that exists so far beyond my perception. So when listening to all these albums, I took it upon myself to kind of do my best to go and read and watch older reviews of her older music, to, you know, do things like watch the video games performance, to sort of catch myself up to speed and see what this is like on the outside looking in, because I knew Lana Del Rey was a pop star. I knew that like the girls in my class in like 8th grade, and like when I was, because this came out right as I went to high school, like freshman year. So going back and listening to Born to Die again is very strange, because you sort of hear all of these sounds that you're really accustomed to in pop music nowadays. But at the same time, you kind of have to take into account that this is the genesis for so much of that. And in that respect, it feels like a decidedly calculated move. I feel like a lot of big movements in music, when you look back on them retrospectively, they feel really preordained. And it feels like at this time, at this moment, the world had a Lana Del Rey shaped hole in it. And I kind of feel like that sort of non-starter that her first record was maybe caused her to artistically pivot into something that she and the people surrounding her and the collaborators on this first album here, they decidedly wanted to make something enormous, because that's the big thing that I come back from Born to Die with, is that this album is focused on bigness. It's focused on big emotions, big instrumentals, big everything. And when you contrast that with Lana's actual presence as like a voice on the album, that's what gives it what is kind of special about it, or what was special about Lana when she came out, is that she has this very willowy vocal presence that is just a very small part of these songs. Like, I mean, obviously it's an important part of it, but when you compare the scale of these instrumentals to her vocal presence, it very much feels very unique. And for that, I think that the album, for the most part, kind of rides this sort of continuous line of success of establishing what Lana's interests were, not just musically, but like lyrically. Very much from the get-go, you sort of get, broadly speaking, that she is indulging and simultaneously subverting this retro American aesthetic and kind of updating it with anachronisms so that it feels quintessentially contemporary, but also rooted in an inescapable, omnipresent past that's rooted in a lot of toxicity. And when it comes to the dynamics between men and women, women in America, and the broad idea of American culture. If I can compliment this early phase of her career for anything, it's that this is a present element across every single thing she ever does. And it's really strong out of the gate. And I have to broadcast with the fact that I'm not really hugely into this. And I have to kind of levy that halfway, being that I have a lot of criticisms with this album, but at the same time, I also very much missed the moment on it. So I feel like I'm missing a kind of vital part of the cultural experience that you all have that I do not. But at the same time, even as someone who has a lot of issues with this album, I feel like people really didn't give her enough credit. Like, again, that rooted in cultural misogyny that Lana was sort of cast into, it's really hard to avoid that when you look at people who are trying to assess her record and just sort of like, oh, this romanticization of all of these things. It's like the whole time you just kind of want to shake these critics and just be like, do you think she doesn't know that? Like, do you think that the people behind this aren't very smart? Because it feels very much like, you know, you're listening to somebody who obviously read a lot of S. Scott Fitzgerald in high school, is very much aware of these tropes and indulging in them. And I never feel as though it's somebody who doesn't understand these things, these fantasies, these ideas, these stories. And that is to say, I like the vibe, I appreciate it, and I like the size of a lot of it, and just generally a lot of the instrumentals on here sound really great still to this day. That said, a lot of her anachronisms on here feel like they don't make sense to me. There's stuff like Diet Mountain Dew, for example, the mention of her being more into hip hop on songs like Blue Jeans, which is one of the best cuts on here for the record. They feel modern, but they never escape being ill-fitting with this version of her. The usage of the main device in video games being another aspect that feels like it kind of clashes with the details of the song. And for me, it's just kind of difficult to get over how these two things don't go together. And I get that that's probably a lot of what makes her unique and appealing and what makes her style so interesting. But charting her trajectory over these past decade, I just feel like she kind of does it a bit more confidently and a bit more deftly a little bit later. There's like a populist and lowbrow bent to her hooks and central song ideas, but they never really kind of feel like they connect or exist within the same realm as other lyrical ideas in a given song. So that's a bit weird for me. And I feel like maybe exposing myself to some of Lana's music post this definitely informed my opinion here. But at the same time, I really do appreciate how tight of a construction Lana as an artist has over just plain basic pop song construction. There's real great performances on here, some great vocal dexterity, some effective key changes. She'll lean into these affectations, sometimes vocally, that feel very parodic, that gives her a kind of versatility on here, and they are very effective. I think Off to the Races is kind of a prime example of where her normal vocals are contrasted by these very hyper feminine phrases in the chorus that just feel a bit intentionally limp, and the strength of the core of the vocals is really kind of, it really just serves as a really memorable song idea. So I have a lot of conflicting opinions on this album, but I'm broadly with it for the most part, that is.
That conflict you're describing, and this is kind of getting to the absolute core of the appeal of this to me, that conflict you're describing, the anachronisms, that sense of disconnect between the, I guess, aspects of modern American life and modern American culture and these kind of archaic, I guess, retro classical American ideals, that clash, that sense of like bringing the past careening into the present moment is the appeal, is what Born to Die is to me. It's exactly why critics, I think, felt very similarly to what you're expressing, the sense of confusion and bewilderment at the way in which she was doing that, the way in which she was kind of colliding the past with the present. That is kind of at the core of what Lana is trying to do here, I think. It is about the idea that sort of American culture and everything that Lana sees as representative of who she is, of the place that she lives in, of the world that she loves, is everlasting, right? Exists on the spectrum where the romanticization of the past is equally as valuable and a part of who she is as this kind of rich embrace of the present. Like, this is what Lana is all about. It is about taking all of these ideas of traditionalism in American culture and bringing them into the present moment, and showing you that, you know, what American culture looks like now and what American culture looked like 200 years ago is really not all that different. And that's kind of, I think, at the core of what Lana is doing with this record, kind of at the core of who she is as well, and her worldview. And you can also use that lens to look at the way that she talks about relationships and relationship dynamics on this record. But Jake, you and I have talked enough at this point. Coffee, I want to throw back over to you at this point.
You know, I actually wanted to mention how one thing that I do find interesting about the kind of musical and cultural context behind this is that what she's doing here is very, or was very fresh, new, whatever for the time, but it seems very deliberately inspired by what Amy Winehouse was doing in the 2000s, not necessarily for relationships, but the way Amy Winehouse is, you know, blending, you know, sounds from the 50s into the sounds of the 2000s, you know, whatever. And Amy Winehouse died a few months after video games came out. And Lana talked about that before, but it feels like the door for someone like Lana to truly like shake the whole pop scene, throw the door open on the whole shit was it was there. And you know, obviously Amy was talking about substance abuse, and Lana's more talking about being in relationships with older men, being, you know, in these abusive situations. And people weren't fully aware that she was aware of that sort of thing. I think the cultural response to that was more so in response to how the fans took it, because there was a huge, you know, fan base on Tumblr, on Twitter, whatever the fuck, that was like, you know, small, like 15, 16-year-old girls who were taking those lyrics at face value. And so I feel like a lot of the cultural response to this album can be kind of seen through that lens of like, you know, concerned parents or concerned adults being like, oh, my little girl's listening to music, talking about doing drugs, overdosing, being with men 20 years of their senior, whatever. And I don't have too much to say about the actual music, because everything that could be said about this record has been said a dozen times, a dozen ways over the last 10 years.
That core sense of, I guess, contrast between, the traditional and the modern is a kind of, excuse me for using this word, one of the most pretentious words of all time, is a kind of dialectic that Lana will use throughout every record she makes in different ways, and she evolves the way that she uses that, and that's the thing that kind of sits at the core and makes it Lana in a lot of ways. And what you're talking about as well, about the way this was viewed through the lens of its audience and how they were responding to it as well, speaks very clearly to the way in which thoughts and feelings and viewpoints and lived experiences of teenagers, and particularly teenage girls, weren't taken very seriously at that particular point in time, or weren't taken to indicate anything of significant meaning, which, it sounds ridiculous to us now, right? Because you can't deny the lived experiences and the perspectives of the audience that is like one of the biggest consumers and one of the biggest participants in active culture, right? So that those people and that audience were feeling seen, and were feeling spoken to, and were feeling as though they had someone who, wasn't necessarily describing things they had experienced, but gave a kind of voice and a romanticization to the way in which they viewed their lives, the aspirations they had for the kind of life they wanted to lead, and that feels very true to the aspirational and the kind of maybe unrealistic and dreamy way that you view your life at that particular juncture, and the way you want the kind of appeal and aesthetic and glamour essentially of romanticization in general. And in America as a setting, and America as a cultural artifact fits in with that beautifully. So that's the core of what Born to Die is. It's sort of introducing this dynamic, basically introducing this character who sits at the center of it as well, expressing in various different ways the way in which her connection to culture in its many different forms, and the way that she negotiates her relationships are a firm and central part of who she is. It's kind of this idea of embracing elements of yourself that would be seen as stereotypically shallow and kind of disregarded, like, oh, this person's shallow because they're into this, or because they have bad relationships, or they date these people, or they do these things, and kind of embracing that and reclaiming that and kind of hoisting that up as something that is not necessarily something to be sneered at or looked down upon, and maybe a viewpoint that represents some institutional prejudices or views towards women in general that maybe need to be confronted. And what's interesting about that is that Lana, all this is kind of subtext, all this is kind of flavoring to the music itself, which is just at its core so ridiculously, exuberantly, it's this extroverted sound, this massive hugeness with this tiny little presence at the center of it, this very intimate voice. It's like, she's just this little element that sits at the heart of everything, and from inside of her, this hugeness just emerges. And that is like, it's the most extreme example of Lana's dynamic in her whole discography, basically, because it's the one with the most vast difference between her intimate performance and the sound of the record. I think maybe even as her career goes on, that dynamic kind of gets kind of squished, so that there's less and less dynamic range in that sense as her albums go on, but that then becomes less of the focus as her songwriting and storytelling and those sorts of things become a bit more what she's doing artistically. But anyway, that's Born to Die. It's worth noting as well that the Paradise EP came out basically alongside this, and then later in 2012, Born to Die was re-released as the Paradise Edition, which is the version of the album that I'm most familiar with as well. It has a few bonus tracks, which are good, but really the Paradise EP, I think, is the chief appeal of this version of the album. Has one of Lana's biggest songs on it, Ride, which is a song that I absolutely love, as well as some deeper cuts that I'm particularly fond of. Has, of course, the maybe infamous Cola, which is, that iconic opening line of that song, My Pussy Tastes Like Pepsi Cola. That might be like the most representative lyric of this entire era. Like, yeah, it's garish and you can kind of make fun of it for how silly it is, but like that idea of directly drawing together, like sexuality, romanticism, the inherently feminine quality of Lana and Lana's music, and the kind of consumerism that represents, the heart of American culture. That's all distilled into that one line, which I think is really funny. But anyway, yeah, what do you guys think of these additional songs and how they complement the album?
It could come across as being like entirely creatively repetitive. And in some respects, I'm sure you could accuse it of being that, but fundamentally, everything on here is about as strong as everything else on the album. I particularly am really fond of Deep Cut Body Electric. It's one of the more hazy, atmospheric things on here. And I just really, really like the hook of the song. But as an experience that's a bit tighter, I think I end up slightly preferring it to its album counterpart in many respects, just because, again, there's not that many superficial or aesthetic differences, and it's just very much feels like that same experience. If I remember correctly, isn't like a song on here on like the Baz Luhrmann Great Gatsby soundtrack or something?
You're thinking of Young and Beautiful, which we will talk about in a minute, but isn't
It
on
came
this
out
EP.
That's right.
like 2013, I think that was.
Yeah.
Worth noting on Paradise is something that I actually put this in my notes, that Lana Del Rey covering Blue Velvet makes the most sense in the world.
Yep.
And it begins
Yeah,
it begins a tradition of Lana kind of covering these sort of staples of classic American music that
yes.
is not my favorite thing that she does when she does it, but it does make sense. And often the choices of covers that she chooses tell you a lot about what she's, the angle she's going for in the particular kind of part of American cultural history and all that kind of thing that she's channeling. And we'll talk about those instances as they come up on each album.
Before we move on from this era in particular, I want to note a couple things. First of which being, it is absolutely astounding to me that Lana was never picked to do a James Bond song, because you listen to Born to Die and it's just like, hey, here's an album full of songs that could feasibly all be James Bond themes. And the fact that Billie Eilish eventually got one doing what is more or less a minimal Lana Del Rey song. Again, it's just the cultural artifacts keep coming together. If I can make a comparison from this era of her music that is just specifically engineered to piss every like pitchfork reading sneering person who'd ever looked down on Lana's music, is that when listening to her earlier stuff here, the thing, and it might just be because I'm so this band pilled and we did a retrospective on this band last year, but I really couldn't stop drawing parallels between Lana and The National in the way that the especially in this first album, the whole satirical America meets alcohol drenched lushness when it comes to the aesthetic, especially on that first album where, you know, Matt Berninger is barely fucking audible on it and he just sounds like this tiny pathetic little alcohol addled presence, and they're both kind of leaning into these ideas that are combining the sort of retro American aesthetic and a kind of modernity that's both very like, it clashes, but at the same time it works because, again, it's like Riley said, so little has changed since then. But like, it still feels like there are songs where Lana is writing about a guy, and that guy could feasibly be like Berninger on
yeah.
songs from like Alligator. Like, it really could be.
Let me just say this. Boxer is a Lana Del Rey album. Wearing indie rock clothing, like that album, like
So
that is just
true.
so much of what Lana Del Rey is, but from a obviously distinctly masculine perspective. And also there's kind of the slight difference between kind of Lana's sort of very California soaked perspective and the National's kind of Ohio born Midwestern perspective. But anyway, yeah, I think the National are a great reference point.
Also, a comparison I'll keep making as their careers keep going on, and when their careers eventually collide, and I've been over this with Jake, is The Weeknd. House of Balloons came out in 2011 and had basically the exact same effect on R&B that this album did for pop.
And I was fucking obsessed with that mixtape, the whole trilogy when they first came out as well. That was one of my gateways, I think, into, you know, sort of taking, this is going to sound so pretentious, but as a teenager, taking pop music of the moment seriously. So yeah, the way they dovetail is really interesting. And I'm just realizing, like, we're blitzing through these for time related reasons, but I just want to take a moment to shout out the fact, because I love Born to Die. I think it's her, I'm gonna spoil my ranking as I go, I guess, but I think it's her second best record. I adore this album. I think that you know, it hits this energy and it masters this whole aesthetic, this maximalism with this intimate kind of core so well. And there's only a couple of moments I'm not really in love with, and they are back to back, which is Diet Mountain Dew and National Anthem. Kind of lean into the kind of cloying aspect of her a little bit more. But even those songs I like. But I mean, come on, the first 4 songs, Immaculate, Dark Paradise, and Radio, back to back. I love those tracks. Summertime Sadness is just absolutely huge. I kind of wish that the record had ended with that, just because This Is What Makes Us Girls is a kind of strange closing track choice, even though I like that song. And my last thing I want to shout out is that I mean, Jake, you alluded to kind of the Bond theme kind of hugeness and the sense with which Lana's whole personality congeals with that. We're actually going to, when we get to Honeymoon, there's a particular song on that record that's heavily rumored by Lana fans to be a song she was going to submit for it to be the Spectre theme, and we'll get to that. But yeah, I know your favorite song on the record is $1 Million Man, Jake, and that's the That's the song that going to mention that. That's the song that most exudes that.
$1 Million Man is my favorite song of hers from this particular like nascent stage in her career. And it's weird just because it seems to be a song that nobody really cares all that much about, like not one that's particularly beloved by fans, or like it's just kind of one of the songs on Born to Die that isn't like one of the singles or anything. But I really think that it feels like everything successful about this era contained in one song. Everything that's meant to be clever actually kind of like is legitimately. It's a little bit less leaning on the kind of starry-eyed naivete that she displays a lot on here, which is fine, but I just like the perspective is refreshing. But I really like the sincerity and emotionality of the performance going on here. It feels like there's a very active attempt to do away with any of the irony that she might have been performing some of this with beforehand. And it just has it's a great performance. It has a seductive melody. It's great production. And it's just, again, the distorted synths and lush strings are two great opposing sonic ideas that she does really, really like and uses a hell of a lot, but it's because she's damn good at it. It's a really great way of, you know, the dichotomous nature of the beauty and the ugliness that's being together in the same space. And it's very good. And it's nice that she essentially based the entire next stage of her career off of this one song.
I also want to appreciate as well that even as Lana would refine her lyricism, and you know, she would lean into particular tropes and traits fairly regularly across her records, and they become a core part of who she is. And that kind of very kind of classical imagery that she uses repeatedly, you know, you could denigrate a lot of it as cliches, but they're kind of the point. Like the point is capturing something that has been expressed in a particular way and leaning on that image because it is the best way of getting it across. So she would go to refine that as her records go on. But I want to just, again, as the emo kid, I want to shout out some appreciation for some of the cringy choices on some of these songs as well. Like they don't always work.
Please.
But I appreciate, you know, like I think it's not by any means my favorite lyric from this era, but I just want to appreciate the pure Lana Del Rey-ness of on the song Gods and Monsters, the line, in the land of gods and monsters, I was an angel looking to get fucked hard. Like that's just that's perfect Lana right there. That's
fucking Chat GPT Lana Del lyric generator.
That's like my least favorite song on the Paradise EP. But every time she sings that lyric, I just get this big grin on my face. I love that part of Lana, and it's not something that goes away necessarily as Lana's career goes on, but certainly becomes more refined and then into her kind of, I guess, later period stuff.
We talked about this when we talked about Midnights on the show, and it's something fundamental to the presence of this artist and understanding her and enjoying her is that you must understand and embrace that Lana Del Rey has been and will always be cringe, and you need to learn to love that about her because it is baked into the core. And I say that with the most sincerity. Once you accept that, you will enjoy artists like Lana or Taylor who fundamentally have this baked into who they are as artists.
And it just kind of gives you an excuse to think about, okay, well, why do we view this as cringe? And what is that actually telling us about the way that we look at human expression? You know, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but it's an interesting thought experiment.
Just real quick, I just wanted to know that since you guys were mentioning Taylor, that Wildish Dreams off of 1989 is a Lana Del Rey song.
Oh yeah,
and it is like the most budget Lana Del Rey song of all time. Yeah, style too. You know, these ideas, the imagery, the production. Well, I just wanted to mention that those are just Born to Die
totally.
songs.
That
Yeah.
I maintain, you know, obviously Taylor was heading on this artistic trajectory, and I'm sure she would have made a record like and sounding like 1989. But I think that record would not exist remotely in the way, in the shape and the form that it does, if not for Born to Die. That is maybe the most direct and obvious example of this record's influence, is that album, I think. And there's an interesting kind of leapfrogging between Lana and Taylor in terms of how they not necessarily influence each other, but kind of like borrow from each other and do slightly similar things and evolve their career progressions in similar ways, particularly with Taylor's pivot into singer-songwriter records in the last few years as well. So that's an interesting dynamic we can kind of reference back to if we want to. The final thing I want to say about the Born to Die era, about these two releases anyway, is I want to shout out a song I think is very underrated on the Paradise EP. I think it might be the oldest song from this whole era, which is the song Yayo. I don't see the song getting love anywhere. It's originally the closer on her proper debut record, but it's in a re-recorded form here. I love the kind of sultry 50s jazz tone of this, mixed with the, you know, the kind of blunt seductiveness of the lyrical approach. And there's just something about this particular track that I find to be really enchanting. And I think, though it's sort of the oldest and most kind of nascent thing in terms of what Lana's doing here, I think it kind of also, it sort of presages some of the ways in which she'll evolve her sound into going into more minimal jazz and 50s inspired sounds later in her career as well. So I just want to shout out Yayo. That song does not get nearly enough love. I really, really dig that. Quick acknowledgement, and I think this is important to acknowledge as well, for, it's already been mentioned, the 2013 single Young and Beautiful, which was originally released for the Great Gatsby soundtrack. Now, you know, I'm pretty sure that however you feel about this song is going to tell you how you feel about Lana in general, because in a lot of ways this feels like,
and the movie it's featured in, for that matter.
Well, the movie, yeah, whatever. But yeah, it's certainly fitting for that movie. But disregarding the film,
that's what I mean.
This is like, I hesitate to use phrases like the quintessential, because there's kind of not really one. I mean, maybe video games, I guess, but you could debate. Basically every Lana era has one or two like quintessential songs, but this is one of the most quintessential Lana Del Rey songs to me. This is one of the songs I remember most distinctly from my teenage years. This is one of the songs that to me kind of just encapsulates Lana so perfectly. And also, you know, it's this just powerful, strong attachment to the idea of love and being loved and beauty and all of these aspects of the way in which beauty and attraction and romantic relationships are like romanticized, you know, in American culture and that sort of thing, with the darkness of, you know, the implicit acknowledgement of it all being an illusion, of it all being a kind of dream, and all being a kind of willful state of mind that you choose to keep yourself in. You know what I mean? Like, will you still love me when I'm no longer young and beautiful? Where the implicit answer to that question is no. But Lana deludes herself into believing that the person will, right? That the romantic kind of image or the dream that she's kind of painted for herself to live inside of is something that is so inherently vulnerable. And there's something so beautiful, so sad, but just so wonderful about it. I think it's so quintessentially Lana.
All right, do we have any other last thoughts on this?
No, we can move into Ultraviolence at this point as well, because this is the cool thing about Lana, is that she has never really taken a break. And, you know, that might be something that makes her so exhausting to a lot of people, to the thought of engaging with an artist who's so prolific and releasing these massive statements and one after another. But there was actually a brief period, I'm not sure whether it was before or after making her next record, where Lana was seriously considering retiring from music. I think she was really disillusioned by a lot of the reception, not just to Born to Die, but the way that she was treated and the way that she was viewed in the culture more broadly as well. Yeah, she was sent into a really, really dark place. And in a lot of ways, the dark place that essentially her public humiliation, if that's not too over the top a way of putting it, took her to this particular artistic place that she sort of stayed within for several albums, basically, until she kind of clawed her way out of it. And this is this real darkness, this real moody sense of being overwhelmed by fatalism, right? But also the romanticization and the sense of excitement that comes with being in danger, basically, a sense of excitement that comes with living your life in a place where, you know, essentially things could go off the rails at any moment, things could fall apart any moment. No one loves you, so you have nothing to lose, basically. That's the kind of mind state that a record like Ultraviolence imbues. Came out in the summer of 2014. She recorded it with Dan Auerbach of the Black Keys, who contributes heavily musically here as well. It is a very distinct sonic pivot from Born to Die. And, you know, in some senses, you know, Lana, this was better received. In some senses, it almost feels like, because the aesthetics Lana was leaning into here felt more, I guess, acceptable in terms of like what was viewed conventionally as art, you know, versus, you know, shallow or whatever. But there's still so much of the same Lana from Born to Die coming through in the personality on this record. It's just, you know, heavily scarred and affected by what she's been through, basically. What do you guys think of Ultraviolence?
You were correct that Lana was, it was after Born to Die that she was thinking about quitting. And then like a year later, she came back and said, no, I'm making another one. She had finished the record by the time she met Dan Auerbach, and then they hit it off and revamped the entire thing. Nobody knows what the original record sounds like. She was working with collaborators from Born to Die, so it was speculated that, you know, it just sounded more like Born to Die before Dan Auerbach came in and fueled, you know, these songs with more guitars, made it darker, that kind of thing. The one thing that stands out about this record to me is the title track and how it interpolates the Crystal songs "He Hit Me and It Felt Like a Kiss."
Thank you. That's the
Which was
first thing in my notes as well.
Yeah, I didn't know that was an interpolation until a few years ago, but that line and that song and that idea feels so quintessential to these early years of Lana, and the idea of being in love with something that hurts you, being in love with bad relationships, you know, that kind of thing.
I was a little bit worried, honestly, when I went back through Lana's discography that, like, again, I had a very tepid, lukewarm opinion on the music of hers that I had heard. So after listening to Ultraviolence, I was sincerely worried that this is where she would top out for me, because I honestly, with very few qualifiers, I think this album's pretty great, honestly. I think the one thing about it that may not get along with some people, at least, is just how hard of a pivot that sound is, and that this is also a very big sound, but it's also, I mean, don't mean to throw around the R word, but reverb. It is here, and there's plenty of it, to the point where it feels like Lana is almost trying to channel like Beach House in some respects on this album, which again falls in line with a lot more of my sensibility. So of course I was probably going to gravitate towards it more, but it feels like the sort of darkness that was born out of that reception from Born to Die, and just maybe her not exactly feeling herself before actually coming back with the motivation to start a new record, that like she's kind of doing a pivot thematically, and that she looks like she's at least maybe not fully subverting, but advancing her previous work, where it feels like the grandeur and austerity of Born to Die is replaced by this hazy, slushy malaise. Like the opener is repetitive to the point of being like a mantra of sorts, but this feels like an act of reclamation. Lana is superficially hovering around all of these topics and iconoclasty, and that she's drubbed up before, but here it's all in the name of lampooning the shallowness of like a man in her life. She's like a siren on this, who seems to hold power as she lists off all the things that the man in her life values, and they're all, you know, nothing more than Americana tropes. I like this as an opener just because it really feels like it's a mission statement for the album as a whole. And frankly, the whole kind of first leg of this album, Cruel World through West Coast, is just really solid to me. I'll even go on a leg and defend I've seen at least a lot of controversial takes about the song Brooklyn Baby, but that's the thing, is that that's one of the cringiest songs she's written up until this point, and that is exactly why it works. But to me, it's the moment where she sort of crystallized her appeal for me, where I was just like, oh, this album could be like the one with me, and that's the song Shades of Cool. To me, this is her first genuine true blue brush with perfection when it comes to solidifying who she is artistically, just like all of her best sensibilities meaning together in this. Just, I mean, the instrumental in this is fucking hard. It seems to be like the whole album is like a hangover, and it really contrasts to Born to Die feeling like a kind of drunken party. But this moment is the sobering moment, the moment where you wake up and you try to drink coffee and forget the fact that you have a hellacious fucking headache. And the guitar solo on here, combined with the really lucid vocal performance, is just electrifying. It really tangibly manifests its hopeless portrait of Lana and her lover. And I really, really like when this album tends to lean into those sobering aspects, because it feels like it adds a dynamism to everything Lana talked about, while still allowing her to kind of indulge in these tropes and these artifices and all these things that she's always been interested in. It doesn't always 100% work, but even when it does, it's admirable. I think that Money, Power, Glory is maybe the moment on this album that works the least for me, because it kind of feels like autopilot Lana. It's just kind of like, it sort of feels like everything that this song does, other songs on here do better, and lyrically it just doesn't do a whole lot for me. It's still within the context of the album. I don't even necessarily think I'd want it like removed. It's a 50-minute album, and it does kind of, for Lana, that's actually kind of short, but it feels like it gets a lot of mileage out of its sound. And I've seen some people critique this album for sounding like its bigness sounding kind of gray and hollow, to which my response is, Chad, yes, that's the vibe. Like, that's the deliberate melancholy here is supposed to feel kind of like
suffocating.
That artifice is having it's having a hole poked in it, and it's deflating. It's something that's channeled very well, and I think that that's one of the most admirable things about Lana in this stage of her career, is that the sound always feels, whether or not it's successful, feels intentionally synergistic with what she's doing, like lyrically speaking. And I think that it rewards heavily on Ultraviolence, even if I would say that this is a very, very front-loaded album, though I really do like the ending 1-2 punch of Old Money and The Other Woman. The Other Woman, in my opinion, being the second best song on here after Shades of Cool. It's a great closer, and it's like, I just kind of leaving like the lyrical ambiguity of leaving it up to interpretation if Lana is the other woman, or is envious of her, is afraid of becoming her, etc., etc. It shows a thematic dexterity that she builds on in records like Norman fucking Rockwell or Blue Banisters, or just a lot of the inception for what she does later is found here.
Yeah, I mean, worth noting as well with The Other Woman as well, another example of Lana covering a classic American standard, in this case a Nina Simone song, and also a track that has this kind of additional potency given some of the songs prior to it on the record, like Sad Girl, for instance, which is one of my favorites, where she's singing about essentially, being in a relationship with someone who has another girl on the side, basically, and how that makes her feel. And it's not necessarily all over this record, but certainly within her discography more broadly, she sings at various points from various perspectives within a love triangle, essentially, or within a situation where you're maybe having to give up a certain degree of power, or maybe you're overexerting a certain degree of power over your partner through your liaisons with other people. She's sung as well, and will continue to sing about being the other woman. And so the way in which that The Other Woman kind of is this sort of follow up to Sad Girl in a certain sense, talking about, okay, well, in that song I was cheated on essentially by this person who I absolutely adored, essentially, and here is me, seeing myself move into the position of creating that situation for someone else. So there's this, there's dynamics across these songs, and there's not quite storytelling necessarily, which she will hone as her records go on, but you start to see a sense of world building within this record. Born to Die is a really satisfying album front to back, but this just feels a little bit more like an album in the sense that it is constructed to tell these stories that exist within the same world, and that kind of interrelate and maybe even reference each other at certain points. This is a record that I remember listening to when it came out, and I remember really, really loving Cruel World and West Coast, which still stand out to me as amazing songs. Cruel World in particular is my favorite song on this record. I love, particularly as the opener, I love what a pivot this is. I mean, Lana comes in here, her vocal performance on this is kind of harrowing, frankly. Like the way she sings the chorus and just all the vocals on this song, she sounds genuinely like almost terrifying. Like she has this sense of haggard witheredness in her singing here that sounds as though she's, you know, been drinking whiskey for weeks, and she's essentially, you know, or bourbon, I guess, which is the refrain of the song, the alcohol that's referenced. It's just genuinely, Lana sounds defeated, but also angry and dejected. And there's this sense of a brutality to it emotionally that really just bowls me over every time I listen to it. And yeah, that trio of Shades of Cool, Brooklyn Baby, and West Coast are kind of like pure Lana distilled. I really like Brooklyn Baby. I've had a weird experience when I first revisited this album where that song like just really hit me the wrong way. And then I listened to it again. I was like, no, I really like this. It's weird how some Lana songs do that sometimes. There's, of course, the tragic story of the fact that she was supposed to record that with Lou Reed, but as soon as she arrived, like literally as soon as the plane landed, when she was going to visit him, she got a text that he had died on the same day.
Son of a bitch.
So, but you know, he's still alluded to lyrically there. West Coast is like just one of the most, it's the most grandiose the album gets, I think, compositionally. And I really like how it's a very different kind of grandiosity musically from what you get on Born to Die. It feels very sort of 70s, very classical. Basically from Pretty When You Cry onwards, I'm all but checked out from this album, unfortunately. The rest of it doesn't really do much for me, and it's not necessarily that it starts being bad or anything, but just that the effect and impact of those first 6 songs kind of feels like it's exhausted a little bit by the time you get to that. I will tepidly stand up for Money, Power, Glory, though, which is kind of maybe the song I like the most in this backstretch, purely because it reminds me of Florence and the Machine, specifically the vocal performance and the sound of it reminds me a lot of Florence and the Machine, but specifically How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful era Florence and the Machine, and Ceremonials as well. Those 2 records feel like they are like Ceremonials influenced Lana, I think, and then How Big, How Blue is kind of influenced by Lana. And her vocal performance has a little bit of Florence in it as well. And just the strings and the swelling of it reminds me of that title track on How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful, which I love a lot. So yeah, while the rest of the song is a little bit slight, there's something there that speaks to something that I recognize and enjoy. It's worth acknowledging Fucked My Way Up to the Top, which I don't think is a very good song, but at the very least is Lana kind of tongue-in-cheek nodding to one of the chief criticisms that she received, or one of the chief kind of barbs that was thrown at her, this idea that she essentially bought her career. And I love that. I don't have the exact quote on hand, but there was an interview she did where she was like, you know what, I did sleep with a lot of you know, men in the entertainment industry, essentially, but I don't see what the problem with that is. I did that, but it's not the reason why I'm successful. So yeah, look, I think there's a lot to enjoy about this record. The atmosphere, the intensity, again, the claustrophobia of that mix, the way in which these songs feel like dust clouds, basically, is really, really appealing. Coffee, I'm keen to hear a little bit more from you about this particular record, and if you...
I do agree that the album is like super front loaded. I think by the time it gets to Pretty When You Cry, it just kind of washes over me, the rest of it. And especially the bonus tracks, because the only version that's on Spotify, I don't know about Apple Music, but the only version that's on Spotify is the deluxe, and the deluxe tracks are not good. There's some of the only like Lana tracks I like vehemently dislike. Black Beauty, Guns N' Roses, 40 Kilos. Those are the most generic, forgettable songs in her career. But again, the first half I love the title track. Like that's one of the first tracks I ever heard from her that made me like, but especially, you know, going back to the refrain, He Hit Me and It Felt Like a Kiss. That was like one of the first moments in her career, or exploring her discography. I was like, what the fuck am I listening to? You know, especially hearing that at like 15, 16, whatever. I was like, okay, that, you know,
that's a step much further than anything on Born to Die.
Yeah, no, you know, she implies it obviously on Born to Die, you know, with these ideas of power dynamics, but you know, it's like that song, and you know, others, you know, where she like fully like dives into it, like this is what it is to, you know, be in this position. This is, you know, what it is to have not these fetishes, but you know, to have these ideals and to have these preferences like I do, you know?
This is maybe like an interesting juncture as well. We don't have to talk about it in detail now because it will keep coming up. Talking about Lana, the way Lana negotiates the particular relationship dynamics that she talks about in these songs. You know, the accusation, and again, I think it's a bit more relevant later on because it's something she directly addresses with Blue Banisters, but the accusation that, you know, she romanticizes abusive relationships, right? This idea that she talks about, you know, abusive dynamics in relationships and presents, you know, the female perspective in that as something to aspire to, basically. Or more broadly, this idea in which she kind of romanticizes submission, which I think is actually, so okay, here's an important distinction to make: the distinction between glorifying an abusive relationship and romanticizing submission. You know, and that's something that in the way in which we culturally talk about sexuality, we've gotten a little bit more nuance and a little bit more understanding than maybe what people we had when Lana was first talking about these things. But it's certainly something that has always been this kind of thorny point that people have pointed at Lana's songwriting and said, you know, this is, you know, we didn't call it problematic back in 2014, but we called it like, I don't know what people called it, but so there's this interesting thing that Lana talks about, and it's a particular perspective on fulfilling a particular role within a relationship, not necessarily because, and again, I don't know that Lana necessarily has a fetish or has this kind of desire essentially to subject herself to pain and suffering in the context of these relationships, but there's this idea that what she values and then the connections that she pursues inevitably come with the cost of pain and suffering. And it's not that she seeks out these relationships so that she can be hurt. It's just that she comes to realize that is inevitably a product of the kind of love that the kind of huge love that she feels, and the kind of, you know, intense connection and need for company and need for a romance that she has. It always comes with pain and heartbreak, and heartbreak hurts, right? And she often, you know, talks about and uses the language of physical suffering and of pain, and in this case of Ultraviolence, of actually being struck and evoking that Crystal song as a way of, you know, effectively communicating the pain of heartbreak, right? And the sense with which even when someone is, you know, hurting you, and no matter what kind of hurt that is, when you have that deep need for them, when you have that deep sense of love for them, then that becomes just another way in which they express that. And it's, you know, it's thorny, it's difficult, it's strange, it's tough, but there's a lot of, I think, oversimplification of the way Lana talks about relationships and pain and suffering and heartbreak and all those kinds of things. And Lana, look, on her most recent record, I mean, and on her couple of her most recent records, she's alluded to, you know, abuse and suffering in relationships in a more direct way, and we can get to that when we get there. But I think it's also, you know, worth saying that, you know, a lot of the time when Lana talks about suffering and pain in relationships, it seems as though a lot of people haven't given her the credit of maybe assuming that she's being metaphorical to a certain extent as well. And she's talking about pain in a sense that, you know, she's maybe not necessarily talking about physical abuse, but just that, you know, again, when you feel and you have this intensity in your relationships and the way you emotionally connect to people that Lana does, you know, the language of violence in its many forms makes sense and is effective. And it's a huge part of the identity of this album. So that's, I think, worth acknowledging. All right, well, we've got a good pace, so let's keep it moving, and we move pretty briskly into the next period of Lana's career. Actually, I think it was only the very next year after Ultraviolence where Lana released her third major label studio album, Honeymoon, which on the face of it is another pivot for Lana. Although I would say that while, you know, it's definitely a record that is more refined and more sort of polished and more, I guess, accessible from a production standpoint than Ultraviolence, there's more similarities between this particular record and that one than I think people might be willing to acknowledge or might even see initially. There is a continuation of this kind of smoky, dark, very sort of mid-20th century aesthetic that Lana occupies. Honeymoon, from its brighter colors and its general presentation, looks as though it might be a more inviting or optimistic record, but it really isn't. I mean, this is, again, Lana is still, I think, in the throes of a very dark period in terms of her artistic inspiration. And that continues into Honeymoon, I think, which is, you know, and I know, Jake, you're gonna go into this, which is, you know, a record that was very easy to overlook because you know, Jake didn't even know it existed until fairly recently.
I went to rate your music to see all of her albums, and I looked at it and I was just like, what the fuck is Honeymoon? And I'm like, I cannot stress to everyone listening how I did not think this album was real until about 2 weeks ago when I listened to it. I've never heard a soul talk about it. I've never seen any Twitter screenshots of any of the songs posted from here. In my mind, she went directly from Ultraviolence to Lust for Life in my head. So when I discovered this album's existence, I was kind of preparing myself to just not think much of this. And it's very strange because this is definitely not a better album than Ultraviolence, in my opinion. It's a deeply uneven experience. That said, I have a remarkable amount of affection for this album because of its high points. Like, when this album is great, and it often is, it is the best she has ever been up until this point. No better showcased, in my opinion, to what is easily my favorite Lana Del Rey song, Terrence Loves You. This song, like, once I heard this song, I was like, okay, I was a little skeptical before. Ultraviolence kind of won me over in the end. But this, I was just like, okay, I think I might actually be skirting along the lines of being a legitimate fan of her now, just because this song is stone cold pop perfection. And it comes after 2 songs that I think are also really good. I think that the opener, Honeymoon, and or Music to Watch Boys To, are decent cuts, but they don't feel like they kind of have their own identity. And then this comes along, and this feels like the moment where the record actually starts. From like the opening somber guitar licks, it floors me. Lana turns her lens like both inward and outward, seemingly in the wake of an imploded relationship, and explores not just her connection to iconography of things like old Hollywood and jazz very superficially, but how she relies and depends on these things once she's left alone. But it's never stated outright. So much of the beauty in this song is in what's unsaid, which is like a genuine first for me with her. It feels like there's a very careful portrait being painted, and Lana is being purposefully very oblique about this painting's contents. Is this a breakup song? Is this a song where she fatally attempts to psychoanalyze the man who left her? Is it the faded afterimage of a man who left her in an attempt to paint him as two-dimensionally as she might her typical dalliances into Americana? I can see how it might feel half-formed to some people, but to me, this is careful. The horn embellishments on here are fucking sublime. Everything here, both lyrically and instrumentally, feels methodical, captivating. It's got great hooks within it that kind of linger in your head. And the way it just kind of bleeds post-relationship loneliness and the attempt to grasp more permanent emotions once you're left behind in a state of like permanent transience. Like, fuck, man. I was going through her shit chronologically, so it doesn't mean much when I, like, at the time when I thought that this was going to be my favorite song of hers, but it kept being. And that's not to say that I think the rest of her career fails to live up to this song. She has plenty of other songs that I think are, bare minimum, as good as this. But holy shit, this is incredible. It is a shame that the album itself just kind of flutters in between these insane high points like that song or Religion, or my second favorite song on here, the penultimate track, Swan Song, which is also one of my favorite Lana Del Rey songs. And then there's songs like Salvatore, Art Deco, Freak, High by the Beach, and I'm just...
Put some respect on Freak's name.
That's the best song on here to me. And that's my favorite song on here. Freak, I love that song.
Well, Coffee, I want to hear from you then. What are your thoughts on this record as a whole, and what is it to you?
This is where I'm going to clash with Jake a little bit, but this is, not to spoil the ranking, but this is my least favorite Lana record. Just straight up, like, I get where she's coming from, and I've read up on this album. She deliberately tried to go back to a more Born to Die sound, but just with more perspective, I guess. And I appreciate that. And there's some great songs on here. Terrence Loves You, Honeymoon, Music to Watch Boys To, High by the Beach, Freak, The Blackest Day. Love those songs.
Yeah, Blackest
Everything
Day.
else kind of bores me, but that's and it's not that there's anything here without merit, because I understand what she's doing. Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood is a pretty good Nina Simone cover. It's not my favorite cover of that song, but it's a pretty good Nina Simone cover, you know, and I appreciate what she's doing with songs like Art Deco or Salvatore or, you know, 24 Swan Song, whatever. It just kind of bores me. And I don't know why. And I can't explain why, because everything here should appeal to me. You know, the production is, you know, tight, the instrumentals are solid. It washes over me. I could not tell you why, but it does.
Well, okay, that's interesting. I'm kind of glad you have that perspective, because it kind of allows me to talk about something, well, this is the thing. Like, one of the things that is so appealing about Lana as an artist to me is that each record she puts out, for the most part, has this very distinct identity that feels like, okay, here, this is a new chapter for Lana. It doesn't mean she's going to be sounding completely new. It doesn't mean she's going to be talking about completely new things, but it feels like a new chapter. It feels like a new stage in the way that she's evolving this core thing she does, which is this, again, not just juxtaposition, but this actual, like, melding of the past and the present, sonically, aesthetically, culturally, in terms of things she evokes and the moment that she's in, all those kinds of things. Like, Lana's, with each record, Lana's going to be doing that in a different way. With a couple of exceptions, there are 2 albums in Lana's discography that feel as though they are more like stepping stones on the way to those statements. And this is one of them. The first sort of stretch of the record, I think, which is my favorite, particularly those first 3 songs, that to me feels like Lana both continuing from the smoky 60s shade of that last album, particularly in that kind of those eerie swells of Honeymoon, which I think is a really just captivating opener, really kind of sets an environment beautifully for this entire album. And then just the kind of smoky kind of, wearing sunglasses and kind of just this, it's so atmospheric, so intense music to watch boys to, which is a huge standout on the album to me. And then into Terrence Loves You, which I'm agree with Jake. This is one of the most sort of emotionally potent and evocative songs Lana's ever written. It also is kind of revealing in a certain sense, and then it speaks to obviously how influenced by and how much she loves David Bowie, and kind of how much she sort of craved recognition from him during his lifetime, and didn't really.
That interpolation on there is so fucking smart, though. Like, a lot of people will give songs like this shit when they interpolate like really famous pop songs, but like, even the interpolation here is being used as like a tragic and pointless attempt at connecting to her lost love through the things she finds comfort in. The "Can You Hear Me, Major Tom" refrain, it's recontextualized within the song so well, and I fucking love this song.
Well, I mean, the thing that makes it really devastating is the fact that the title refers to David Bowie's brother, Terry Burns, who died in 1985. And there's this idea in which Lana sees,
I did not know that,
in the, I guess, tragedy of that loss, and in the kind of insular life of Bowie, this kind of connection that she sees, not just with his artistic personality, but with something fundamental to him about as a human being that she relates to. And again, this idea of mutually experienced loss and negotiating that. It's a beautiful song. I agree that it's an uneven record. It's kind of like the record kind of has these flashes of brilliance that usually last like 2 or 3 songs, and then you'll have another 2 or 3 songs that just don't work. I don't dislike High by the Beach. I get that it's probably the most contentious song on this record. It's, Lana's first flirtation with, trap Lana, which, I think has an immediate precedent in the way that Born to Die integrates the EDM sounds of the time, which in a lot of ways were precedent for the way in which hip hop would evolve. But certainly, this is one of those moments where you get, trap Lana, and you'll like it or you hate it. There's a particular trap Lana song that is actually one of my favorite Lana songs, and we'll get to it. It's not this one, but I will give this song credit. I don't dislike it. It fits in well with the aesthetic that Lana's carved. It's very much just this different slice of the same sort of atmosphere and thematic content as music to watch boys to. So I enjoy that. I think Freak is a really, really good song as well. I like Art Deco, particularly the kind of squiggly sax that comes in halfway through that song, gives that a little bit of extra color. I find the run from Burnt Norton through Religion through Salvatore to be just doesn't do anything for me. But then the Blackest Day, 24, Swan Song come in, and those 3 songs are excellent. 24 being the song I alluded to earlier that many fans speculate Lana was going to submit as her Bond theme for Spectre. Never did that, and of course it never got picked. But if it had have been, my God, this song is so good. This song is like
Yeah.
absolutely one of my favorites here. I love 24. I love how she absolutely nails that atmosphere, that sense of danger, that sense of intensity. It is like absolutely my favorite track on the back half. Although the Blackest Day as well is like has my favorite moment on the record as well. I mean, just the way that she just absolutely howls like in all the wrong places. Oh my God. I'm butchering it by trying to sing it. But the way she nails that chorus, just like I get shivers. That shit's so good.
Mhm.
It is just the fundamental issue or the fundamental limitation, I guess I would say, of Honeymoon is that it doesn't have that sense of clear identity. I actually like it narrowly more than Ultraviolence, just because I think it has a bit better of a hit rate for Lana overall, and the best stuff is staggered a little bit more nicely than it is on Ultraviolence, as well as having a little bit more diversity in its palette, because Ultraviolence is very moody, very gray, very much in one space, whereas Honeymoon has aspects of that, has aspects of the pop landscape that Lana's kind of infusing into what she does. It's a little bit more diverse and colorful, and I appreciate that. I think Lana is showing real artistic ambition and a sense of forward motion here. It's just that it hasn't quite arrived at something that has a holistic singular identity the way that, spoiler alert, her next record will. But yeah, it is a good album. I like it.
I just wish I liked it all more, you know, like there's the great moments on here really are great. And I can just never get over the final hurdle of there just being a sprinkling of songs in here that I'm just like, God, this album's like what, 65 minutes? Like, please, God, just make some essential cuts. And this is easily one of her most consistent projects, but it really does kind of get bogged down in itself occasionally.
It's like the only record really where consistency is an issue. Like, no, not an issue, but it's like the only record where consistency is like a core issue for me. Because she's got other records where, they're too long. Yeah, there's songs that are less essential, but I'm kind of willing to forgive that for the scope and scale and the size of what she does and the sense of it all feeling like this realized vision. Whereas here,
we're prog geeks. We lend that stuff a lot more credence than I think a lot of critics might, because we like big, indulgent, emotional, messy shit. So
yeah. Whereas here, it just is like something that I don't have that overarching thing that I can point to and say, this makes it easy for me to forgive the mixed bag nature of what Honeymoon is. But yeah, I still want to stump for it like Jake. I think it's a good album. I think it's a slightly underrated record, but it is certainly, with the time I've spent with Lana's records this week, it has certainly kind of become a little bit dwarfed by what exists on either side of it.
There is one thing, actually, this doesn't have much to do with the record itself, but there's a hypothetical I want to present. All right. 24 was, and we don't know if it actually was for Spectre or not, but let's just assume it was. We all know the Sam Smith song sucks for that movie.
Terrible fucking song.
So, but would you prefer 24 or Spectre from Radiohead?
I knew you were going to ask that.
Shit.
I think those are both great songs. Honestly, I like 24 a little bit more. I like the Radiohead Spectre song a lot.
God, I might too.
The thing is, like, it's a great song, Radiohead Spectre. I mean, never let it be said that I would dare to say a negative word about Radiohead. Oh no. But I think that Lana just fits the mold more naturally than Tom York does.
Yeah.
He does his best and he really does nail it. It's a very but that song, I think the Radiohead song, it really for the most part works because of the instrumental and because of how well the band capture that whole vibe.
It's because it is a good Radiohead song, whereas this feels like it could be like a Bond song.
Whereas this song has the great very Bondy instrumental, and it has the core vocal performance that feels like it just slots right in, and I there's that part of me that wants to say Spectre because it would be the more interesting choice, because it would be the male voiced singer doing something more unconventional for Bond. But yeah, 24 it would be my pick, but that's a
narrowly.
Either way, Writings on the Wall is like bottom 3 Bond songs. Just
exactly.
God, it really. I like the Madonna Bond song more than I like the Sam Smith one, and I'm totally serious.
Yeah, same. So that's I mean, shit. Okay, well, let's move on then to the fourth major label studio record from Lana Del Rey, and I think a pretty significant one in terms of her artistic progression, and one that is, I think, fair to say, and I only say this because I know how Jake feels about it, going to be maybe the most contentious discussion we have yet, which I'm very excited for because I love when we disagree. Lust for Life. And the thing that strikes me about this immediately and most obviously is that now look, all of Lana's records up to this point, obviously major label backed, have a lot of big names behind the boards, sound really great. This is like a next level sonic upgrade. Like, this thing sounds like $1 million, legitimately. It sounds like all of the resources in the world and all the money in the world was just kind of poured into making this sound as expensive and big and refined as possible. And that's something that, especially when you come off the back of Honeymoon and that sense of confusion and identity, and in terms of where Lana is at sonically, feels like a real breath of fresh air. This is, and I'm going to say it so Jake doesn't have to, it's a long fucking album, that's for sure. But it is, along with, her first two records, it absolutely 100% nails its particular aesthetic toolkit, basically. And it is a record that I would describe as luxurious. Like, it is a record that you put on and you are in the world of Lana Del Rey for an hour plus. It is a dour and dark record. Like, don't get me wrong, Lana hasn't quite come out the other side of, her tendency towards dramatic sort of negativity, even despite the fact that the brilliant album cover has that just amazing photo of her grinning ear to ear. There's a sense with which Lana is kind of fighting and forcing herself towards that, trying to fight her way out of the darkness, but she hasn't quite reached it here yet. So that aside, though, this is a record that feels so much less subsumed in this mire of negativity and of claustrophobia than some of those earlier records. And in a weird sense, though the first time I listened to it, it was exhausting for sure, I've in a weird sense come to really, really love this album. It captures a particular side of Lana and a particular version of her at her most exuberant, as well as this kind of extraness that comes with having a lot of money and being able to kind of funnel it into this massive project. It feels like a very true distillation of who Lana was and the kind of things that Lana was reaching for. And you know what? I think Norman fucking Rockwell, which we're going to get to next, does too. I think these two records feel like the most kind of fully realized Lana records in completely different ways, because they're completely different realizations of who Lana is. But they are like peak Lana. I think we're entering this period, 2017 to 2019, which I view personally as peak Lana, artistically and creatively. And it's not to say that there's not going to be great records in the period following it. There absolutely will be. But in terms of Lana Del Rey, the craftswoman, Lana Del Rey, the artistic visionary, Lana Del Rey, the stratospheric sized landmark in the music industry, this is the peak Lana period. And then after it, she goes into this kind of peak Lana singer-songwriter period, which is very Lana, but in a very different way. Whereas this is Lana scaling the heights, cementing herself as the kind of artistic figure that she wants to be seen as with these two records. And Lust for Life is her, positioning herself as this master craftswoman and this master, it's her 1989 in a weird sense, even though it doesn't have the same kind of pop ambition and desire for hit songs as that does. She's basically, ever since Born to Die, completely lost interest in making those kinds of songs. But it represents, like, to me, the fullest realization of Lana as this icon, basically, as this iconic figure in the pop landscape. And then, we'll get into the counterpoint of that with Norman fucking Rockwell in a minute. But yeah, that's to me what this album is on the whole. I have specific thoughts on certain songs that I'll save until you guys have had a chance to talk about how you feel more broadly. But yeah, Coffee, I think it might make sense for you to go before Jake on this one. What are your feelings and perspectives on Lust for Life? I know, given you told us earlier that this was kind of where you entered with Lana and obviously you have a relationship with it based on how you experienced it. But yeah, I want to hear what you think of this.
This album, I think, largely has been kind of by the fans, because I'm not too tapped into like the Lana Del Rey stan base. I love her music, but I'm kind of like tapped in my own way as compared to like, people who make fan cams or whatever the fuck on Twitter. But as far as I know, people kind of see this as one of her weaker albums, and I don't get that. I love this one. I love this one from start to finish, even though there are some songs, and I'll get into it, later. There are some songs that I think are kind of stupid, especially "Summer Bummer," which is
Oh,
which has
Look,
the dumbest Playboy Cardi feature of all time.
I have a
Sucks.
whole thing to say about Summer Bummer. I'm going to save it.
Every time I remember that song exists, that Playboy Cardi is on it, and he's only on it because he does ad libs that you can barely hear because they're so drowned out in the mix. And this is before Dial It, before a whole lot of Red, but that was always funny to me. Anyway, you said that this isn't one of her more pop-leaning records, but I think it is, especially in some pockets. Like "Lust for Life" is a pop song,
Yeah,
all the
for
way down
sure.
to the Weekend feature.
Yeah.
So is Cherry,
Mhm.
so is Love, especially in the back half. She kind of drops that. But there are some like real deal pop songs on the front half of this record, and I love all of them. "Groupie Love" I think is the better ASAP Rocky song on here. I love that song. I have so much nostalgia for this album. It's kind of hard to talk about it objectively. The other thing I'll mention about it is that "Get Free," great song. That's one of my favorite
Yeah,
Lana closers
I
of all
agree.
time. Love that song. I'm sure you two may or may not know of it, but
Yeah, I know what you're
that
going to
song
say.
caused a lawsuit because it has the same
Oh,
chord
really?
progression as Radiohead's "Creep," and
Yeah,
it,
they were.
Oh
oh,
my
yeah,
God.
Radiohead sued her, or it wasn't Radiohead, it was the label that sued her because it has the
EMI.
exact same
Yeah.
chord progression. Yeah, as
I was gonna
Radiohead's
say
"Creep."
Radiohead didn't give a shit. They're like,
Yeah,
fuck
no,
it, rip off Creep. We don't care.
Well,
no,
it's
I
kind
could
of
be wrong, but I think Tom York came out and was like, I don't give a shit,
because it was a huge deal, and because Lana made it a huge deal, right? So EMI didn't sue her, but they kind of like basically issued a demand, basically that Radiohead be credited as songwriters on the track because of the same chord progression that it shares with Creep. And look, this dovetails into a whole discussion of copyright that has dominated the 2010s that I don't want to get into because it's a whole thing. But yeah, Lana posted on her Twitter like that Radiohead were suing her and they wanted 100% of the royalties from the song, which isn't true. But I'm sure she was probably pissed off. This was a whole thing that happened, that people were talking about this for weeks. That Lana had the fact that Tom York commented on it tells you how big it must have gotten, because normally he wouldn't fucking say shit, but he had to like step out and say it's whatever. But yeah, that is one of the funnier bits of like the story behind this album, and speaks to how kind of big of a moment it was as well. But yeah,
I'll get into more specific tracks. Like "Tomorrow Never Came," which is like nobody ever talks about that song, but that is one of the best Lana tracks of all time.
it's fucking
one of the best
fantastic.
on here for sure.
Incredible song. That's one of the only good things that Sean Ono Lennon has ever done for culture and for music. But
What I love about it is that it's great because it's a great duet, and Sean O'Lennon is fantastic on it, but he's also kind of fantastic because he's doing an impression of his dad. Like he's just channeling that vocal.
It is like she got him and was like, "Will you sound like your dad, please?" And then he's like, "All right."
Yeah.
It's not like he does anything else in music.
Yeah, there's like that moment on the record where you have the Lennon and the Stevie Nicks features back to back. Like that to me is like Lana's sort of ascending to this higher plane of like, firmly, just if there were any doubt, kind of cementing her place in the history of American culture, basically. And even though the Lennons are obviously British, but like this pop culture thing more broadly, like that's kind of a victory lap moment. I got so many thoughts on this, but I want to give Jake an opportunity now.
Because I know he has thoughts.
And I also know what Jake does when he's in this kind of situation. I know how hard it is for him. I know I've seen it many times. So just forget about justifying your opinion. Just tell us how you feel and tell us what your experience has been with this album. And don't worry about whether it's good enough.
I'm never gonna forgive Playboy Cardi for haunting my opinions on trap music for the rest of time because of Whole Lotta Red. But this is the thing, is that when I again went through these records in order, and I was like, after Ultraviolence, and I was just like, stone cold, I'm a fan. That's a good record. And after Honeymoon, where I was just like, this isn't great, but I love so much of parts of this that I'm willing to give this a shot, because like I knew this is like her most divisive record. It's like one of her more lowly rated ones. It's not an album I feel like I've heard talked about particularly positively in the past. So I saw it and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go into this and listen to it with a completely, like, the only thing I knew other than it being divisive was that I saw the 2 A$AP Rocky features in a row, and I was like, I'm sure that's going to be something, but whatever, man, I'll give this a chance. And I will say, for as much shit as I'll throw this album, I want to say that it suffers from the opposite problem of the last record, that I think this is immensely backloaded, like so backloaded for me anyway, to the point where it just buries every song that I respond to in that sort of, you know, the 8-track run. And even then it has moments within that 8-track run that I do not care for. But I will say Tomorrow Never Came, great song. Change, great song. Get Free, great song. So never let it be said that I don't at least, you know, that I'm not just sort of taking this purely at face value. And hell, I think that Love is a really strong opener as well. Like,
are you implying a shit talk on the first 2 songs of this album? Because
no, I think Love is super good. I like the distorted guitars that show up on here. The lyrical slant is really interesting. It presents Lana as someone way more on the outside looking in, like singing about youth and naivete as though it's something that's kind of long passed her by, which is something very different than what she's been talking about on the last couple of records, as she's sort of an active participant a little bit more. And she's got a more distinctly vocal, like a mature vocal presence on here. And I really think that cadence sort of buoys a lot of the vocal performances on this record. Towards the end, there's actually like a really smart shift where she inserts herself as someone who sort of desires and is now participating in what she was speaking on previously. So the angle is from a more wizened perspective. There's a really great development in this song. And look, okay, I know Lust for Life is like, the title track is like fine, but I have a reason for thinking it's just fine. It sounds good and nothing is like tedious or whatever. Like I find some of the other stuff on here, but the Weekend feature here is really bizarre, because part of me, like, as like Coffee already mentioned earlier, it's like their sort of artistic ascendancy is very parallel to one another. Like on a spiritual level, the Weeknd's kind of toxic but self-conscious masculine pop star hedonism and Lana's tragic femme bad girl thing should work together, and it does. But there's not much that they do with their interplay beyond exchanging some bits of lyricism that, like, I guess reflects the mutual nature of their combined toxicity.
There's not much they do with it besides craft a perfect pop song.
Exactly.
I mean,
thank you, Riley.
Well, that's the thing, is that Lana's kind of slow vocal drone and Abel's high-pitched crooning is just such a huge clash for me that I'm not sure that it doesn't work. But Abel's voice cutting through the cloudy production on here is like a jump scare that keeps happening. And like, again, it's just an unsteady moment for me where I just don't really get it, I suppose. And I mean, 13 Beaches has some colorful production, and I think, you know, it's got a great vocal performance, but this just kind of fails to animate me. It kind of feels like Lana's just sort of pontificating this nebulous state of love and loneliness, and simultaneously the song structure here just kind of keeps going back into first gear over and over and over again. And then we get to where the album really starts to lose me with Cherry. Cherry is a mistake. It is not a terrible song, but the stuff, like the production just completely undercuts the vibe lyrically. The lyrics are a little bit more, they're just kind of vague inanities, and the seeming ad-libs of bitch and fuck in the background are unintentionally fucking hysterical.
I think they're
they further kind of
hysterical.
I mean, if they're intentionally hysterical, then I don't know what the fuck this song is going for, because it's supposed to be like a vibe, and I'm not like kicking myself laughing while trying to experience the vibe. The tonal coherence of this is just nothing
like
to me.
Smiling
I have
when
no
the
clue
firing
what's
squad's
happening.
against you.
an album with Playboy Cardi cannot be anything but self-aware when it comes to ad-libs.
I want to agree spiritually, but it's kind of that instance of that initial problem I had with some of the earlier stuff, like on Born to Die, where like I get the intentional contrasts, and like I get that that's probably what a lot of people see in stuff like this, but for me it always comes across as being clunky here, like occasionally before it worked. However, after this, we get the run of songs of White Mustang through God Bless America, and I am fucking
That's a long
out
run of songs.
cold for this. Yeah, but it's a long fucking album. White Mustang is like, I don't know what the hell's up with this song. Lana's attempting to do like a deconstructive parody of herself or something on here. She's done this whole shtick before, but this is just rote and boring and tedious, and I do not care for it. Like it's flat as paper. And at the risk of being expected or boring, just because I know that this is like one of the more lowly rated songs and it's got the Playboy Cardi and A$AP Rocky feature, but I just don't know what the hell is up with this song. I don't really have any interest in Lana trying to recreate, like she sounds like she's trying to recreate like a zombie FKA Twigs song, and she doesn't really have the dexterity or the knack for, you know, carefully choosing producers who fit this style in the first place. But then A$AP Rocky shows up on here, and the most fucking here's your feature, thanks for the money verse I've ever heard in my life.
Make you wanna quit the bitch you dating.
He's rapping over a beat that genuinely does sound AI generated, and like it feels frivolous, but not in a way that I like. And then right after that, you have another song with him on it. The hi-hats on Groupie Love sound like they were ripped straight out of fucking GarageBand. The rest of it is so fucking boring that I have nothing to say about it besides the fact that turning up your orchestral strings to max volume does not count as a worthwhile sonic idea. But like, in my feelings, I don't know what you two feel like about this song, but this is Lana's worst song, in my opinion. The high frequency synths in this sound like dental tools. I'm begging Lana at this point to find another trap beat that doesn't sound exactly like it. Sounds like a preset. And generally speaking, this is so thin and inessential. It's just a total deflation. I have almost nothing interesting to say about it because the song gives me nothing interesting to present it with. And then there's Coachella, Woodstock in my mind, and it just feels like the album is never going to recover from this point. I'm trying to stay awake. I didn't want to become this person when trying to reassess her albums. I want to give this a fair shake, but this sucks. Then Beautiful People, Beautiful Problems comes along, and I'm like, okay, the vocal harmonies between Stevie and Lana on here, it earns me a pulse. I'm digging this. I like this. And then Tomorrow Never Came, as we mentioned before, is very good. Life Rocked Me Like Motley is such a funny fucking lyric. Imagining Lana listening to Generation Swine made me giggle, and it was the only thing keeping me awake at this point. Then there's fucking Change, which I think, like, where the hell did this song come from? This is properly heartrending stuff. The piano balladry angle really works to break up the monotony. I mean, this song's fucking haunting. Really kind of broadcasts a lot of the stuff she's going to do on her later albums on here, and I'm totally into that. And I similarly think that Get Free is a good ending. But man, like, other than the bookends, like 50 minutes of this, I am out cold. Like, this is all of her worst tendencies as an artist to me, sort of culminating in a moment where I'm like, I want to buy into this sort of tasteless aesthetic going on here, and it just doesn't work. And I'm sorry, I know that's boring, but like, I tried. I really did.
Jake, no one is ever going to not believe you when you say you tried, when you're doing these kinds of, when you're dropping these kinds of takes, because it is painfully obvious how hard you've tried. Look, I get all of that. I do. I understand that perspective, and I'm sure like a lot of people probably feel that way. Like it is one of Lana's longest records. It is of the longer records Lana's made. It is like so devoted to this very insular, I wouldn't quite call it minimal, but there is this kind of sedate sort of pace to it and atmosphere and all that kind of thing. Like you get those really exuberant, larger than life songs with Love and Lust for Life right at the start. And a lot of the record is, you know, I mean, Lana's just post Born to Die. Lana's just never going to make a record that has that level of animation for its entire runtime, because that's just not something she's interested in sustaining. And she's too, her perspective and the way that she presents herself is just too insular to really be conducive to that. I want to add 13 Beaches to the run of like brilliance at the beginning of the record. I think that song is fantastic. I think that the central sentiment of that song, Lana having to visit 13 beaches before she can find one essentially where she can be alone, is a beautiful lyrical idea and neatly encapsulates the place in which she's at in her career and the perspectives that she's coming from, and you know, just giving you this status update for Lana in the form of this kind of beautiful image and this idea and this story of what matters to her, and how, you know, and the kind of images and the kind of places and the ideas that she has sung about repeatedly, but now contextualized by this, you know, space in which she's in at the moment, where she's inescapable and where she's basically, you know, sought after everywhere. And yeah, I think that song is just really, really good. Look, I don't love Cherry or White Mustang. I think they're good songs, so I think they're really solid Lana songs. And this is the thing, like most of this record, even the songs I don't love, they fit into this kind of mold of what this record is doing, that just makes it feel so all-encompassing and captivating, and such a great way of getting you into Lana's world and kind of having you luxuriate in that space. It's a record that really benefits from being played in the car on a sunny day as well. Like, just, it has this whole thing where everything that this album has does is complemented by the car stereo in particular, and that sense of being in motion, basically. It's this great record to just lose yourself in. I particularly, just in terms of like songs I want to defend that are maybe less beloved, I really liked Coachella Woodstock in my mind. It is a great song about going to see Father John Misty in concert and finding it very emotional. That is literally what it is about.
Who among us?
And I like the way the song crests as well. I think the song actually has a bit more momentum to it than some of the songs around it, and ends in a beautiful place. I want to say that God Bless America and all the beautiful women in it. Nice idea. This is the most unintentionally funny song on the album to me, and it's all because of Metro Boomin's gunshots. Like,
what the fuck is happening?
What the fuck is going on? Like, that is so funny, and I guess it's intentional. I guess, I mean,
the fact that Metro Boomin is on this album at all is hysterical.
There's like, you know, she had like kind of a pretty consistent ring of producers, you know, for Born to Die, Ultraviolence, Honeymoon, you know, besides Dan Auerbach, you know, coming in for Ultraviolence, which is kind of an exception. Yeah. But, you know, for this one, she's bringing in Metro Boomin, Benny Blanco, Max Martin, Boy Wonder.
Yeah, I mean, she's
blowing
running the ring. She's
it.
doing all the big names, and it makes sense as well for what this album is. I want to pose I guess it's not a defense. I mean, it is a defense, but I also don't care if you don't like the song, because I like it. I really like Summer Bummer, and there's one particular reason why I like it, which is that the decision that Lana makes to sing this song like she is some kind of predatory creature that is going to devour you whole. She sounds legitimately scary on this. Like, the way she sings, "Don't be a bummer, babe." Like, I feel threatened. Like, there's just this eeriness to it.
Okay, I won't.
That I absolutely love. And I love that she stays committed to that as well. It's just, I hate to use these words, it's also a whole vibe. Yeah, it is jarring when Rocky comes in on here. I kind of think he sort of fits it though, and I don't dislike his voice. I think it's my least favorite part of the song, but it's still not something that ruins the experience for me. If anything, it complements and gives you this kind of very different, distinct thing to what Lana is doing, which I appreciate. I just find Playboy Cardi's contributions here to be funny in a way that I think suits the absurdity of the whole song. I don't want to say that Lana is ever really self-parodic on this album. Like you said, it comes across at certain points, Jake, but I do think there is this sense with which Lana is engaging with the way that she presents herself, and with the decision to make a record like this, where she's delivering it with a certain kind of nod and a wink in a certain way. Like, there's this idea.
Oh, certainly. I want to give her the credit of doing that intentionally. I feel like a lot of people would listen to this, and even if they had the same reaction as me, would still not give her the credit of being an artist who is intentionally trying to subvert a few things about herself. Well, and I feel like she's toying with that a lot on here.
And this is the thing, is she's so committed to her artistic vision with everything that she does, right? And there's no way you bring on those huge, massive producers without kind of, as a kind of artistic person working from that place, without acknowledging, you know, that what you're doing there, the way that you're kind of manipulating the biggest names in pop music. And I think there is something very Lana, very admirable, very kind of just bold about bringing those big names on to make a record that is, you know, apart from Lust for Life, apart from a very few moments, another example of just this very insular, withdrawn perspective that Lana is coming from. It is not a record that screams.
This might be, I think this is the album I would say is Lana's worst. However, it is not the album of hers that I respect the least, because spiritually, I still understand what this is, and I can't say that she failed in her intention to deliver it. So that much I will still give Lust for Life.
My fundamental kind of overarching thought on this is that this is Lana's most aspirational record, right? She's come off the back of making two very dark, two very grimy records that kind of represent her and mired in some of the most difficult parts of her entire life and reckoning with her fame and kind of essentially fleeing from it with both of those albums, basically, and withdrawing and retreating into this corner where she's kind of carving out her own niche as far as possible from the massive pop soundscape of Born to Die that made her famous. And this record is kind of Lana peeking out from that hiding place and announcing that she's ready to kind of embrace that again, but not in the same way. She's kind of aspiring to be at the point where she feels comfortable enough, you know, embracing her success, basically. And the whole record to me is a document of Lana regaining the confidence that she needs to be bold in what she does again. And not to say that Ultraviolence and Honeymoon aren't bold records or that they're drab or whatever, but just that they represent Lana in this really kind of, I don't want to say low or like, I already said withdrawn, but just this really kind of,
I think the word you're looking for is introverted. And I feel like this album is certainly extroverted.
It's extroverted in parts, but this is the thing, what is to me, it is Lana trying to get to the point where she feels comfortable with that. And that is the nature of the arc of the record, right? It is this journey towards trying to drop the introversion and be able to embrace this brightness, be able to embrace this sense of freedom, right? And she's chasing that the entire time. It's about wanting to be happy. Like the cover art is the aspiration, right? Lana, when you listen to this record, you don't hear the person you see on that cover art. You don't hear that massive shit-eating grin. You hear the sound of someone who sees that as the ultimate destination, as the place where they want to be able to get to. And the record is a document of Lana kind of building up the confidence to get to that place. And that's why the final stretch of the record is as impactful as it is because in a lot of ways, it is Lana kind of achieving the confidence that it takes to move forward, basically. I mean, Change, a song that you shouted out as a favorite, Jake. I mean, it's not surprising that you like that song so much, given that it was the last song she recorded for the album. She recorded it live on the piano the night before the album was due. Its whole circumstance was completely separate from the creation of the rest of the record. So yeah, it does stand out for that reason.
Well,
and then Get Free is like, you know, it has this sense of catharsis, especially when you've gone through an hour plus to get to it. It has this sense of arrival that I really appreciate. I don't think it's Lana's best record, obviously. I don't think it's without fault. I don't think it's without things that don't work as well. Like, I really can't stress enough how poorly God Bless America and All the Beautiful Women in it like executes what it's going for. Like, I get that when Lana has the Metro Boomin gunshots, it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek wink at, like, you know, American exceptionalism and, you know, the kind of, you know, firing your gun into the air sort of thing. It's just a kind of a mess of a song. So yeah, there's things that don't work about it. I definitely will agree with that as much. And I look, I think In My Feelings is certainly one of the weaker songs on the record, one of the least fully realized, although it's one of the most truthful, I think, to the reality of the state of mind that Lana was in going into this record. And it kind of feels a little bit like it's more revealing maybe than some of the other moments on the record, to its detriment musically, possibly, but it feels like something I wouldn't cut because it gives you a valuable insight, I think, to where Lana is at. Yeah, overall, I find this to be like a really just captivating and exciting and satisfying album experience. I think that it is, like, in a lot of ways, you know, you could call it transitional in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Lana as an artistic personality, but it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like it that's the undercore, the core of what Lana's trying to communicate about herself, but at the same time she presents a unified front. Yeah, it's a big mess, but it is like a big mess in a way that feels like, yeah, you want a Lana Del Rey record to be this kind of big mess. You want a Lana Del Rey record to kind of take you to all these places. You want to take you on a journey like this. Coffee, I want to throw it back over to you again. I want to hear a little bit more from you on this album at this point.
One thing I kind of noted when I revisited this record is that I feel like, to a certain extent, this album kind of has like a duality to it. Like the first half of this record is very, all of the pop centric cuts are on the first half of this album, and then you get to the second half and you have the Stevie Nicks, the Sean Ono Lennon, the Get Free, the more singer songwriter stuff, which ends up transitioning well into our next record. But I think there's a reason why you have ASAP Rocky, The Weeknd, Playboy Cardi on the first 8 songs, and then she kind of drops that for the second half. It's still a very consistent record sonically and ideologically. I just kind of noted that in my notes. Lust for Life, the song, I love that song. And the one thing I also noted was that, this is where The Weeknd and Lana, their careers kind of cross paths, not just here, but she's featured on Starboy. She has her own interlude on that album.
Yeah, and that was just the year after this as well, so it was kind of like a continuation of this moment.
I love opening track. That was my most listened to song on Spotify in 2019 or 2018, something like that. It was like I was coming off of like a 7th grade breakup, which
hey, those are real. Like we've all been
real shit.
And and that was the song I was listening to. I was like, man, I'm going through some shit. This song is speaking to me, but I still love it. I like how she kind of positions herself in that song as like the bridge between the new generation of kids, who are falling in love, and like the older, generation of people who kind of built the foundation that she's standing on. Oh, Lust for Life, I already mentioned that. I love the refrain of take off, take off, take off all your clothes. I love that.
Yeah.
There's like 3 hooks in that song, and I love that hook especially. 13 Beaches, love that song. Both of you don't like Cherry. That song gets stuck
I
in
like
my
Cherry.
head.
I dig Cherry. It's not a favorite, but I dig it.
I love the hook on that song. I fall to pieces. I love that hook.
The pieces fit.
The pieces fit. Fuck. God damn it.
Summer Bummer is the weirdest song she's ever made. And I think there's no I think there's actually a song on her new record that we'll get into later that kind of competes with it. But
like the thing that I agree, it's one of the weirdest songs she's ever made, and it's like it's a real just love it or hate it thing, I think. And I dig that about it. You can't really, there's no middle ground with Summer Bummer. You either love that song or you cannot stand it. And that's not necessarily something you can always say about a lot of Lana songs. But I like it that this song is one of those.
I have no clue why she put the 2 Rocky features back to back. That is a strange choice if there's ever been one, but I love Groupie Love. I think that's the way better Rocky song. And I don't know why it could also be nostalgia talking, because I do have a particular fondness for that song, especially. It was like 2019 I got into that one too, next to Love, the opening track. Her next record might have something to say about that, but I think Get Free might be her best closer. To me, it might be her best one.
It's a good pick. It's not my absolute favorite, but it is a great song, undeniably.
No, it's just, I love how big this album is, especially because it's after this that she kind of drops any sort of pop star facade. This is her last big tour.
You could view the arc of this record as being like Lana with the first half kind of making the sort of last ditch attempt at seeing what it feels like to be a pop star, and then essentially deciding that no, this definitely isn't for me anymore, and withdrawing inward. Like I said, like I view this as Lana essentially kind of coming out of her retreat necessarily, and sort of like testing the waters and trying to figure out exactly what kind of artist she wants to be. And so there is this arc to it where you get her, trying her hand at a lot of kind of modern pop sounds in the first half of the record, and then essentially taking what she enjoys the most, or retreating from the other stuff and carving her own lane within the second half. So it's like, it's not Lana embracing being a pop star again, but it is Lana kind of finding an artistic confidence through the course of this record, through the course of experimenting. Basically, that's the kind of meta narrative, I think.
As a collection of songs, I love it, but I also think it's maybe the turning point of her career, as from where she was, in the 2010s or in the early 2010s to where she is now. Because, and again, we'll get into it, but the next record is where she like really starts getting into singer-songwriter territory, which is more of her current run. But I think this is the transitional album of her career, the turning point, where she goes from Lana Del Rey, the Born to Die girl, to Lana Del Rey, the singer-songwriter, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I love this album. I really do.
It's kind of like, I guess Ultraviolence and Honeymoon and Lust for Life are kind of like a collective transition period in a weird sense.
Yeah.
Because Ultraviolence and its identity is so reactionary. That whole record is just reactionary. Honeymoon is like, taking the ashes of that and then kind of finding an identity, or experimenting essentially with how these different things that she's done on these two very distinct albums, Born to Die and Ultraviolence, can be kind of reconciled. And then Lust for Life is essentially her completing that arc by essentially figuring out who she is. And so this record, it's hard to sum up because it simultaneously is the sound of someone figuring out their artistic personality, and also but it does feel like this fully realized artistic statement about that process. So while it's transitional, I don't mean that in the sense where I'm talking about why it's weak, but it's just like it's baked into the identity of Lust for Life and makes it such a compelling artistic statement to me. And that, at the start of it, I don't see Lana, the smiling, perfectly happy person, particularly on a song like 13 Beaches, where she's basically, trying desperately to escape her misery. But I do see that by the end with Get Free. So yeah, it took me a little while to verbalize that, but that is what this album is. And I think it's a really important one for Lana, and one of her most sort of significant albums, regardless of where it fits in your ranking. And then we have Norman fucking Rockwell, right? Which was like, I'm going to be honest, I was into Lana, or I was intrigued by Lana with Born to Die and Ultraviolence, but I, like a lot of people, kind of checked out after that. And like a lot of people, this was where I came back in, because this album was so hard to avoid if you were like serious about music, like if you were into music, because this album was just rapturously received. And it wasn't even like following the release of the album. Like I was clued into this from the release of Mariner's Apartment Complex, right? Because that was a song that landed and really made an impact. Like essentially, like Lana had done ballads like that before, but they never had the scale and the size of this. The piano had never sounded this huge. Her voice had never sounded this massive. And the scale of her emotions had never been blown up to this extent. And then, of course, Venice Bitch was the second single, and Lala had never done anything like that before. And while on the one hand, just the idea of a song that kind of long-winded and progressive and digressive and so reminiscent of like 70s singer-songwriter stuff, and like, the kind of more the artists of the 60s who then went into the 70s, this kind of golden creative period, and started doing things that were more bold. That's what that song is. It has that appeal, but also on the other side of it, it's a great Lana Del Rey song with a lot of Lana Del Rey isms that are perfectly executed within it. And so it was like the soil was fertile, right? The seeds were planted for this album to be massive, and it absolutely was. And it's going back to this, like it was, on the one hand, it was kind of difficult for me to revisit this because I associate it with legitimately one of the happiest periods of my life, was around the time in late 2019 where this came out. And it just transported me to this time where everything felt like so much more limitless, and where everything was so much more artistically exciting. Whereas now it's like, things are a bit rough at the moment, but that's neither here nor there. It's just like, it's a huge record. It has this massive sense of scale. It has this massive sense of transportative artistic ambition to it that just makes it so magnetic and so attractive. And obviously it's how big it was at the time as well inspired a lot of, inspired its own little waves of backlash and its own little, like, all kinds of discourse that surrounded this record that I'm glad we've managed to distance ourselves from.
Lana herself stoked that fire a little bit, if you remember correctly, if you were attuned into musical discourse. We don't have to touch on it or anything, but she got herself into some hot water following the release of this album, and that was a moment for sure.
This is the thing, like, Lana has never been afraid to express herself, and I think in the course of expressing herself, a lot of the ways and the things that she's tried to say have maybe been sometimes willfully misinterpreted, I would actually say. Like,
I think that Lana, in this period when I was sort of reacquainting myself with the discourse and what have you, looking at what she had to say in the past, I think that the first part of what she said was very willfully misinterpreted by a lot of people. The second time she went on Instagram and got a little angry and catty with people, a little bit less so. But I will say, I understand the sentiment of what she was getting at. And honestly, I kind of agree with it. She just kind of worded it in the worst possible way somebody possibly could. But she basically, the ethos of this whole like moment was that she was tired of that kind of reception she had gotten from her earlier records, and had said, that people say that I glamorize abuse and all these things, and I'm just a glamorous person. This is just how I am. So this is how it feeds into my worldview and into my music. And it's like, I think that's perfectly understandable.
And that's the perfect response if you're comparing, the way she presents herself to her music as well, which thoroughly imbues that. I mean, this is the thing with Norman fucking Rockwell. Like, some people have read it purely as this kind of cynical ploy for critical acceptance, this idea of like, okay, let's play into the singer-songwriter songbook and make this album that can get people to shut the hell up about how vacuous I am. And I'm not going to say there's no element of that in this pivot, because there has to be. Like, it's so just crafted in such a way as to tap into so much of what is, lauded as the artistic watermarks of American rock music. But there is also this sense with which it is this natural continuation of the way Lana has been artistically developing herself, and just kind of blowing that up to a scale, like meeting her influences from the 60s and 70s and 80s, actually reaching out to them and meeting them halfway and creating something that has the scale and the size that those records have, and that matches the enormousness, the over-the-topness, the hugeness of the way Lana presents her emotions, her perspectives, her view on American culture, all that kind of stuff. This just fits. It is such a full and fulsome realization of everything that Lana is about. It doesn't really go back on or betray anything that Lana has done in the past. It just finds this sharpened, honed, and larger than ever framework for all of those things, basically. And like, Lana is someone who has this massive affection for, and even like builds her whole personality around American culture and American sort of the relationship between sort of traditional American ideals and values and the context of the modern era. And here is where she brings all of that kind of careening into the present day. And yeah, I think this record is a masterpiece. I think it's not a hot take at all to say that it is her best album, but I think that we can embrace that opinion without feeling as though we're shortchanging anything else she's done. It is not her greatest album at the expense of all the other music that she's done, but it is her greatest album because it is this huge realization of so much of what is fundamentally true to who she is as an artistic personality, that it just makes sense. Like, it just realizes so many different things that she's been doing in fits and starts throughout all the records up until this point. Yeah, it is just that bitch.
It's once again a testament to Lana's overwhelming popularity by brute force that this album was inescapable to me in 2019, because by then I was certainly tuned into music. Like, 2017 was the year that I, became a music nerd. So I was aware that Lana Del Rey album was getting lots of great reviews. And up until that point, I hadn't experienced that happening yet. So it was completely alien to me. So funnily enough, as Riley associates this album with one of the best periods of their life, I associate it with the absolute worst point of my life, which I won't lie, maybe had a bit to do with how I initially received this, because it was like, I'm knowing when it was released, it was right in the midst of basically what I would coin as the reason Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher is my favorite album of all time. Basically, I listened to this album and I was like, I guess Lana Del Rey just isn't for me. The soft rock production on here, a lot of the lyricism feeling kind of intentionally prodding and edgy, the whole vibe of it, it just, I did not get along with it. It was an album I was like, I think it's good, but there's nothing about it that speaks to me or that I get along with particularly well. And that was what kept me from exploring Lana's back catalog for the longest time, is because if this is her, if this is the epitome of her work, then if I'm gonna listen to her other stuff, then that's just a pointless venture, especially when a lot of her albums are kind of long and languorous, and it was just something I wasn't going to devote my time to. I just sort of considered it one and done. So doing this, I was like, all right, now that I want to reevaluate my opinions, I'm going to build to this. I'm going to listen to everything in order, and I'm going to deliver my definitive opinion on this record. Who knows how I'll feel? And I certainly think that it does benefit a lot from the context of her other records, maybe more so than any other album that she has, because again, the confidence here and the consistency is what draws me to a lot of the songs on here. In that, one of the reasons this is her best album is because it is the only Lana Del Rey album, in my opinion anyway, that does not have a single miss on it. And not even like a miss isn't like a bad song. It's like nothing on here even approximates being average. I think everything on here is bare minimum fucking killer. I sympathize with my past self a little bit, because the way the album starts with Norman fucking Rockwell and Mariner's Apartment Complex is certainly like, these are two of Lana's absolute best songs. They're some of my favorite songs. Then, however, you get to Venice Bitch, and this is this 9-minute long song. It really takes its time. There's not, like, again, about like half of it, there's not a lot happening. So again, to the uninitiated person that I was listening to this, I think that the album just kind of fell off for me here, and I could just never get along back with it. And now I come back to this and I'm like, this song kicks fucking ass. Where is the Jack Antonoff that produced Norman fucking Rockwell? Because I miss this guy. That not only is this her best album, it's her best sounding album by a pretty significant measure to me. And that's because all across this thing, there is colorful instrumentation and it sounds beautiful. I mean, hell, the way this album starts, the opening lines, fucking the goddamned man-child line, that is how you start a fucking album. And then she gets to the lyric. The one that let me know that I was going to be into her as a songwriter is, why go for the best when I could have you? Like, oh, he's dead. She killed him. Shit. And
she hit him and it felt like a kiss.
And that's the thing, too, is that it's not just because she's like subverting her old work or she's like assuming some kind of power. It's like, this isn't the best Lana Del Rey album in spite of Lana Del Rey. It's because of her. I think all of those vulnerable tendencies that were on earlier records, and even the kind of stuff that plays into her being attracted towards these people who inevitably hurt her, all of that is on here. Like, everything is on here if you look for it hard enough. And I think that that's what makes it such a rewarding experience. It's for Lana fans who have recognized and understood and have liked this aspect of her work up until this point. But I will admit, it's also a lot more vivid on this record, because you have that opening duo of very, like, again, I do think it's kind of not generous to assume that Lana was just trying to appeal to critics with this. To me, that's not what she was doing. To me, this is her delivering a definitive statement, which I think all our great artists attempt to do at some point or another. And that's what Norman fucking Rockwell and Mariner's Apartment Complex do. There are lyrical passages on Mariner's Apartment Complex that are fucking heartbreaking. Like, my God, like the way she compares a lot of, there's a very oceanographic kind of theme throughout this entire album, and she gets a lot of lyrical mileage out of all of that stuff. Not to mention, Lana's always been a great singer. Always been. It's not always been utilized in the exact same way. She's kind of washed out and blurry on albums like Ultraviolence, but that's to its album's benefit. On here, I don't know what happened, but like somebody she did a bump of coke or something, because she sounds fucking awake on these recordings. These melodies are so fucking tight. They're so catchy, and she's showcasing a kind of dexterity that frankly she hasn't showcased since Born to Die. And not to mention, like, she kind of carries that over. Like, there are some albums after this that I think even take this step forward even further, so that was also pretty rewarding to witness. But like, again, man, you go from a song like The Languorous Venice Bitch to something as direct and confrontational as Fuck It, I Love You. You go to Doing Time, which is fucking hard. This is a fucking...
The whole concept, right? Lana has continually done this thing of covering these kind of 60s and 70s standards. And then you go to this record and it's a fucking Sublime cover. Like, it is a fucking cover of a ska punk band.
It is better than the original.
Well, yeah, it is.
It's a trip hop song, and it fucking wrecks. It's just like, it makes me want to go back to fucking Lust for Life and curb stomped whoever mixed those shitty trap beats into those songs. Because there has never been this is my favorite incarnation of Lana's sound so far. But like, both in lyricism and production, this is just, it's so slick and sexy, and like everything about the song works more in this like version of its incarnation, and I fucking adore it. And then, I mean, again, you have Love Song, Cinnamon Girl, my favorite song on here, which is How to Disappear, which I just think it's just, again, it's a jazzy trip hop cover of a track from a Lost Tom Waits album. Like, it sounds fucking amazing. Lyricism and all, it actually makes me think of Tom Waits. Yeah. It's a direct blowback to Consequences of wanting to give into the fantasy that she's hell-bent on maintaining from like the last couple of tracks. And it has this sobering, gorgeous melody. And man, like the way it just knocks it out of the park with those ending songs. I'll even stand up for a song that not a lot of people talk about, or some people say is the worst on the record, and that's Bartender. I think is a fucking amazing song. This album's lesser moments to me are back to back. They're California and The Next Best American Record, which are great songs. I like, again, the only problem
Next Best American Record just knocks. Like, it's not top tier of the record, but it got like the fucking sound of that is just huge. I love Lana describing the object of her affections as cool as heck. Like that's something so endearing about that. So
this begins Lana's weird kind of wholesome arc. Like, Lust for Life was her getting her like tastelessness out, and I mean, that's kind of something I respect about that album. But from here onwards, there are moments where I just find myself genuinely connecting with Lana as a person. Like, before, I just kind of admired the perspective and I appreciated it, but when I listen to this, it's like, oh, I'm listening to Lana Del Rey like as a human being. I feel none of the charade, the persona of artistry that can sometimes obscure even great music and great artists that I love. But to me, there's no filter here. To me, this feels completely raw and bare, and it's soulful in a way that, like, a comparison that's not undue, I think, is that this actually reminds me a lot of Father John Misty, honestly, in like the lyricism style, the production style. A lot of it reminds me of his follow-up to Pure Comedy, and that's an album that is very confessional. It's very much, it's very internal, and it's also kind of showcasing the most diverse array of sounds that he's implemented into his career thus far. And I think that that's the same thing here. I may not be as big of a Lana Del Rey fan as maybe even either of you two, obviously, but like, I may not be the biggest fan in the world, but I feel like I love this album about as much as most people do. Honestly, it's just sensational from top to bottom.
To me, like, it almost feels like Lana Del Rey reaches the climax of her entire career with the song The Greatest, which is just an absolute showstopper, right? From the Jack Antonoff guitar solo to the whole sense of scale and size of the music itself, to the way in which she kind of, every lyric on this feels like a declaration from like a deity of music culture, basically, this kind of overseer. And there's this sense of apocalyptic doom to it as well. It's kind of like, you know, drinks at the end of the world, basically. It's like looking at the death of the
drums on this song is so
you know, it's this
good, man,
overview of the end of an era, right? And there's something about, Lana, who this personality who has always kind of talked about these bygone eras and kind of romanticized and looked upon them, these portraits of the past and of what all that means to her and of how she sees herself in this era of American history that is so far gone. Basically, there's something so powerful about her then looking at the current era that she's existing in and recognizing that something momentous is ending, basically, and commenting on an ending that she is experiencing in real time, rather than something from before her time that she's romanticizing. It is the Lana of Born to Die, but writing a song specifically about the collective death of innocence that happened with the end of the 2010s. There's something about the fact that the COVID era happened right after this that makes this retrospectively even more kind of powerful and almost like prescient in a certain sense as well, because it's kind of like an elegy for the end of an era, like I said, for the end of America almost in a certain sense. And that was something she kind of
made
tried
the last
to do.
album before time stopped.
That was something that was a kind of theme I think she tried to talk about on When the War Comes, We Keep Dancing, or whatever that song was called on the last album, where she kind of talked about what she was observing to be like the kind of death of America. She didn't directly allude to Trump or the Trump era, but it is very much a song that's kind of commenting on that. Whereas this just feels like a better written and more refined, look at those same ideas that takes a bit of a broader lens and just becomes more emotionally involving. And look, the things that differentiate this from Lust for Life, I don't Lana's vocal performances here are much larger than life. They're bigger, they're more booming and that kind of thing, because they need to be to complement these mixes. If the vocal style on this record had been applied to Lust for Life, those songs wouldn't work, because there would be a clash between the vibe and the mood and the aesthetic of those jams, basically, and what Lana would be doing. So Lust for Life is what it is, but it is that way because it needs to be in order for its identity to make sense, just as this is, because for its identity to make sense as well. I mean, I remember listening to this and thinking like, well, Lana Del Rey has peaked as a performer here, and it's crazy that that's not really true, because she would continue, as we'll get onto, to expand her range and her power as a performer
as great as a vocal presence as she is on here. I definitely think this album does not contain her best array of vocal performances. So
a thing that can be easy to forget, because time is a flat circle and all that kind of thing, is that this album came out in August of 2019, but Mariner's Apartment Complex in Venice Beach came out in 2018. Those songs had been around for almost a year before this album actually was released. So those songs were like entire landscapes to me. Like, I remember when I first heard Mariner's Apartment Complex, I thought it was one of the greatest songs I had ever heard in my life, and absolutely one of my favorite songs of 2018, which is already a very loaded year for me personally. And then Venice Bitch was like this whole landscape that I existed within that felt like a massive journey that I was being taken on. I can't listen to songs like Cinnamon Girl or How to Disappear, for instance, without wanting to burst into tears. And I think that
so good.
And I think that, and I'll leave. I won't go into too much detail because I want to leave some. I don't want to steal every point from Coffee before they speak. But I also just want to say, as a final note, I think that Hope is a Dangerous Thing for a Woman Like Me to Have is absolutely her greatest closing track. This song just is a complete, we've already had the showstopper with The Greatest, and this is like the showstopper after the showstopper. There's something so intimate and bare and just absolutely perfect about it as this final moment of connection between and emotion and just expression from Lana. And it has so much of her greatest lyricism, I think, all the way through it. It is just, incredible. All right. Bearing the vinyl in hand, Coffee, why don't you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Norman fucking Rockwell?
There are days where this is my favorite album. Just straight up my very favorite album. The only other one that competes with it is I Love You, Honey Bear by Father John Misty.
The connections.
Yeah, no.
I was going to say, it's the synergy for me.
We'll come up on that connection in a few records.
Yeah.
But there are very few songs that I could say have like made such an impact on me that like I don't know if I'd be alive without them, but I straight up do not think I'd be alive without this album. I think this album saved my life in so many ways. This album helped me get through one of the nastiest periods of my life mid-pandemic. It is, the more I think about it, the more it probably is my favorite album. Just Cinnamon Girl is maybe my favorite song ever, and the way that
Glorious
song
pick.
hits me, it is, oh
It's
my
such a fucking heartbreaking song.
and
Jesus.
Jack Antonoff peaked here, and the thing is, like, he did
Ye-
Melodrama 2 years before this, and
Yeah.
that's a great album too, and
Yeah.
he did great on that album too, and then he does
Mm-hmm.
this, and I like Folklore too, you know, which is a year after
Mm-hmm.
this, and then he falls the fuck off. I don't know what happened to him.
To be fair, I
We'll
don't
get
think
to that.
to be fair, I don't think he's had like you know, he's great, I think. He's really talented and good at what he does. But you know, producers to a certain extent can only be as good as the material that they're given. And Jack maybe hasn't been given material of the caliber of Melodrama or this album in the time since. So
Well, one song that you guys didn't mention that I want to touch on is Love Song, which is like that
Great song.
song. That song is so heartbreaking to me because, you know, it's very, the backdrop to that song is so moody, it's so sad, it's so slow, so syrupy. And, you know, she's singing on that song like she knows it's a relationship that's not going to last. But, you know, she's
Mm-hmm.
still holding on to that last, you know, fiber of hope that, you know, I'm in the backseat of your car, I'm your baby, I love you. Even though she knows, you know, in a month, in 2 months, that's going to be over. She's never going to see this person again. You know, to me, that song really moves me as like grasping onto the last straws of a fling, a summer fling, you know, you know isn't going to last. That was my favorite song off this record for so long. But, you know, Cinnamon Girl, god damn that song. I could Jack
Mm-hmm.
Antonoff's strings on the very tail end of that song, incredible. There are like small synth passages in the background, incredible. The refrain, "If you hold me without hurting me, you'll be the first one who ever did." Christ, man, that is a hook
Oh
if there ever was
God.
one. Even though this record is quite sad in pockets, this also feels like her first record that, like, she is asserting herself as like a force of her own in a relationship. You know, like Mariner's
Mm-hmm.
apartment complex, you know, the hook of that song is very much like, when you're lost, I'll be there. You know, you go to California, it's like, you don't have to be strong when you're around me because I'm there for you no matter, you know, who you are, no matter where you are.
and
Um
even like fuck it, I love you is like, you know, saying you love someone is like the ultimate giving up of your vulnerability, right? The ultimate, like, you're putting your heart in someone else's hands. Basically, you're basically removing all barriers and protections you have. So that is something that takes a lot of confidence, and you know, it takes a lot to do that. So that's one of the most, like, one of those moments where you're like building a whole song around that idea is going, fuck it, I love you. Like, letting yourself be vulnerable and be put in the hands of someone else is like such a huge thing. Not that Lana hasn't done that before, but just the way in which she embraces that vulnerability and embraces that sense with which, you know, this could all go badly, and maybe even likely will, but I can't live my life avoiding that, basically. And it's this huge thing for
Mm-hmm.
her. To me, it's like this big step in the way she's developed her artistic persona, basically. Because, like, in her earlier stuff, she goes into relationships and she talks about relationships with this fatalism, right? With this idea of like, the
Mm-hmm.
relationship for me is inherently doomed. It will always end in suffering, basically. But I am, you know, resigned to that. Like, that is just my fate. Whereas here, like, this is really a big step in Lana developing her artistic personality to a slightly different perspective, where it's like, this may end in pain, this may end in heartbreak, it may not. And it's not fatalistic anymore. It's this idea that there is actually something beautiful and to be celebrated in that risk. It's different. It's the first time where you really get that real sense of a shift in the way that she views relationships and love, and it makes it so feel like this huge development for her. And you know, it also makes it easier to connect to emotionally, because I mean, for me, it's easier to connect emotionally to someone who's talking about, you know, love and the risks of love in that way, than someone who's just being really fatalistic and doomy about it, which has its own value, but is a very different, you know, period for Lana, and it's a very different perspective for Lana. Whereas here, this is the first time, and the crystallization rather, of this different view on romance and love, this much more mature and grown up view on romance and love, that makes it feel more three-dimensional. And again, I'm not saying the two-dimensional stuff doesn't have value or it doesn't have creative merit or isn't interesting, but it's just like, you can't do that forever. right? So that's what's so important to what this record is to me, is that maturing, being able to view relationships and love and all the risks and vulnerability and potential heartbreak and all that stuff involved in a new light that is life affirming, basically.
How to Disappear kind of touches on that, and that, you know, she's talking about like someone who may or may not be in her life for much longer, someone who, you know, keeps going away, keeps coming back. But even at the end, she's saying, I'm here, I'm with my cats, I'm going to be okay. I'm always going to be here. You may not, but that's okay. And that is like a complete 180 from Born to Die. It's a big step for her. And I love it and I love it for that. It kind of informs, you know, where she goes into Chemtrails and Blue Banisters and Ocean Boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's even in spite of Happiness is a Butterfly. Don't I love the bridge on that song. Happiness is a Butterfly. Don't call, you know, the taxi sitting in the back seat crying. You know, I just want to dance with you. I love that. I love that whole section. Hope is a dangerous thing. The most famous woman you know on the iPad. Classic line. It's a great closer too. It is probably the best closer. The Greatest does that feels like a song at the end of the world. And Riley already touched on that, but that feels like the song that like the end of culture. You know, she's saying the culture is lit and you know, I had a ball. Like she's acknowledging maybe the end of a relationship, maybe the end of the 2010s, maybe the end of, you know, culture as we know it. You know, she didn't know COVID would come, obviously, but you know, it feels like, you know, the end of times before COVID.
Well,
I
think the most telling lyric on the whole song, which is not one of the most celebrated ones, and that kind of tells you so much about where Lana's come from her entire career, is I want shit to feel just like it used to when, baby, I was doing nothing the most of all. Like that is the heart of Lana. It is not just this vacant revisionism or this vacant looking backward. It is this looking backward for the idea of control, basically, and having to not, you know, be mired in the ugliness and the reality of all the shit you actually have to do and all the shit you have to go through and experience. You know, that lusting for and that idealization of peace, you know.
To me, this is like one of those albums where like I know everything about it is so good, but like when I listen to it, I just like can't think about any of that because I'm just so overwhelmed by emotion, you know. And I'm sure you guys have albums like that too, where like you think about it in you know in retrospect, and you're like, oh, you know, I like the production, I like, you know, this lyric, that lyric, but this is one of those albums where like I hear one song, I have to listen to the whole thing now because it moves me from start to finish, and it's long.
The purest way you can interact with music.
Venice Bitch, that is such a weird choice for a single. Like, you know, I get why Mariners was the first one, because that's like Mariners apartment complex is a statement of, you know, I'm my own person. This is me now. This is me, Lana Del Rey now. But Venice Bitch, that great song, incredible song. That is such a strange choice for a single, especially for someone like Lana Del Rey.
It's strange and it is brilliant, right? Because it's one of those things that everything about it is a complete artistic shift into something entirely new for Lana, but it is all done so well and so assuredly that it was an instant classic. It pleased everyone. Like the fans love that song, the critics love that song. A lot of people I know who hate Lana Del Rey love this song. It was just this coalescing of so much of Lana's restless artistic impulse into this just massive sweeping piece of music that just, you know, is undeniable when you experience it. One thing to say as well, just to appreciate the obviously there's a lot about this album that harkens back to sort of classic rock records and the art of the album. And so much of the construction of this record is really a testament to Lana's understanding of and affinity for classic rock record construction. I mean, this is just a classic double record. Like you can see in the way that it is sequenced into like these 4 distinct quarters, like the first 3 songs, and then Fuck It, I Love You through to Cinnamon Girl. And then when How to Disappear starts, like that is the quintessential like second vinyl first song on side A of the second vinyl track. Like it just feels like, oh yeah, we're entering the second half of an album with this. And then, you know, that stretch all the way through to a stretch of How to Disappear through to The Greatest, and then Bartender through to Hope as the final quarter. It's just so well orchestrated to fit into that classical structure. There would be no way to resequence any of this without making it worse.
no.
So
Mhm.
I appreciate that on a, that's a more academic level thing, but I appreciate that. It's immaculate. Like, you look at it and it is just imposing how good it is.
This is the one that kind of cements her place as the songwriter of the 2010s. And you can say, there are other songwriters from the 2010s, that you might prefer that are better. Like, I think Father John Misty, again, well, one of my favorite artists, could give her a run for her money in the 2010s. But I think, like, she is the quintessential 2010s artist. From changing the way pop sounded, in 2011 to this album, which feels like the album to end the 2010s, the album for 2019, the album to send off that decade.
She bookended the decade with her two most successful and bold artistic statements, right? Like,
Yep.
and in between is basically, those are great records, Ultraviolence, Honeymoon, and Lust for Life, but they're kind of just connective tissue between those 2 points in a certain sense. And that I think Lana really appreciates, the flow and the artistic progression and the idea of like an artistic oeuvre. I mean, like with the, you colored me blue lines in the first song, it's like a deliberate continuation of like Out of the Black and Into the Blue of Get Free on the last album. It's like this first song is coming right out of Get Free off of Lust for Life. She appreciates, the idea of continuity and of the way in which an artist's oeuvre is going to be interrogated as this holistic thing, and how these different records fit in as pieces of that. And so she really appreciates that, and she understands that. And I think she does interesting things to wrinkle that and to go against what would be the obvious or easy thing to do next with her 2021 records, which I think are fascinating. And we can debate the extent to which they work. I think we'll probably broadly agree on them, but they are fascinating because, again, Norman fucking Rockwell was an immense success for her critically. It didn't spawn any hit singles or anything, but still it was this cultural moment that everyone recognized and appreciated. And so, of course, the question comes, and it was no strange question to Lana. It was no foreign thing for her. How do you follow up something of that magnitude, right? What do you do next? And when you are an artist, you do the unexpected, right? Or not necessarily the unexpected, but you certainly don't do anything that's obvious. Lana crested on the wave of this through 2020. And it's funny, like, even though it came out in August 2019, Norman fucking Rockwell feels like one of the definitive records of not just that year, but also 2018 because of the big singles coming out in that period, and 2020 in terms of, the impact of this and the sense of relevance lingering through into the beginning of the COVID era. But then you get Chemtrails Over the Country Club. You get, before you get that, you get Lana releasing her first book of poetry, Violet Bent Backwards Over the Grass, which came out in 2020 as well, which was, again, Lana doing a lot of what you've expected from her songwriting, but crystallizing and distilling that into the poetic format. And I think that if you enjoy Lana, if you like Lana as a writer, you'll enjoy those poems. There's a lot of very evocative stuff in that collection. And that mindset, that more writerly mindset, that set of focusing more on lyrics and on storytelling and on Lana kind of really detailing her world and her worldview is something that really colors every record she's made since Norman fucking Rockwell. And that starts with Chemtrails Over the Country Club, which, made a bit of a stir with its album title, which I think is really, really kind of cute and funny, and is given has given a neat bit of context in the title track on the album itself. And look, this is my least favorite Lana Del Rey album. This is, I think, I alluded earlier to the fact that I think there are two records in her career that really stand out as not quite having the sense of clarity of purpose that every other album has. The first being Honeymoon, and the second being this. There's a sense with which that Lana didn't quite know what she wanted to do with this. And she's expressed that herself. She's expressed dissatisfaction with this record, with feeling as though working on her poetry, releasing that book, and also other things that happened in her personal life kind of got in the way of her fully realizing what this is. And I think you can tell when you listen to it. It is a record that, look, this is my least favorite Lana Del Rey record, but because of the way I approach music and the way I approach Lana, like I've come to appreciate a lot about it. And I do think it occupies an interesting place in the progression of where Lana is at. The fundamental things about it is just that it doesn't quite have the sense of purpose or identity that her other records have. And also there is a sense to with which it kind of gets drowned by this overall haze of Jack Antonoff's production. And I don't want to harp too much on that, but it is certainly something that kind of buries a lot of the character that these songs could have. You know, it's a mixture of Lana not necessarily putting her best material forward sometimes, but also like the compositions themselves really kind of sinking a lot of potential that these songs would have. I want to acknowledge the high points though. White Dress, I think, is a really bold song. I really like Lana's almost kind of haunted, broken vocal delivery on this track. I think it's a really striking opener in a lot of ways that I really, really like. I think the title track is great as well. I think, again, it's Lana very much playing into the Lana playbook of songwriting style, but also looking a little bit backwards towards her childhood and her way of viewing the world at that particular time and the way that she has grown up. And there's this additional added perspective with Lana's age that gives it this additional layer to it that I really like. I love the moody nocturnal guitars of Dark But Just a Game, especially the way they're set against this Massive Attack teardrop style snare hit drum pattern, which I really like. And maybe my favorite song on this is Yosemite, which I think is one of her best acoustic ballads. Some genuine fragility in this song, in her vocal performance, but also has this assertive confidence and has Lana talking about something which she would never talk about on any record up until this point, which is her feeling as though a failed relationship actually has some productive meaning. Like looking back on some romantic experience, some connection with someone that didn't work out, and actually feeling proud of that, feeling as though that was an important part of her life, and as though both of them, her and her partner, have grown as a product of that experience. You know, we did it for the right reasons, being the core refrain of this song. And there's, again, it really hones the maturity of Lana's evolving perspective on her relationships that makes it feel like a breakup song that is, you know, it's bittersweet, but it's not maudlin. It reminds you that even through the heartbreak and pain of a breakup, you can extract growth and you can extract, you know, betterment from that experience. And I really love the song for that. But yeah, this is the thing. The things I like about this record are things that are not necessarily core to the album. It's just things that happen on it incidentally. Songs I like for things that represent bits of growth in Lana's songwriting, or bits of, you know, Lana talking about her life or reflecting on things that feel as though they have a new perspective because of how she's grown. But so much of the rest of it feels muddled. What do you guys think?
The first time I ever heard this album, I was so excited. I was like, because Norman fucking Rockwell, you know, that it did so much for me in 2020, 2019. And this album leaked a couple days early, and I was like, hell yeah. And I was I was working a shift at Walmart, and I was like, I'm gonna listen to this during my shift. And I listened to it, and like an hour later, I was like, I was so disappointed. I was so disappointed. And I've come to appreciate it a little bit more, but yeah, I get where you're coming from. This is not one of her better records. I understand why she'd want to go decidedly low key after an album as huge and as world ending as NFR, but I think a lot of these just wash over me. Like, I love White Dress, you know, but again, her vocal performance is like incredible on that song. Chemtrails, love that one. Wild at Heart, I find to be a pretty catchy ballad. For Free is not a great song, but I got to shout out Wise Blood for being Wise Blood,
Yeah.
you know? I mean,
Handily the best part about the song, and not even because it's Wise
Yes.
Blood, but just because there's not really anything else that's interesting about it besides Wise Blood killing it.
and the rest kind of like I like Yosemite. That was a pretty anticipated song within fans. I remember that. Dark But Just a Game, I think, is okay, but the rest is just like this is minor Lana. I think this one and the next one, Blue Banisters, I think are Blue Banisters is more has more its own identity, but I think these are both very transitional records into the new one. I think these are both very much minor works. I think this Honeymoon and Blue Banisters are like the only albums of hers that I would consider not inessential, but like not huge, grand statements of who she is musically, personally, culturally, whatever. And I get, she was coming off of a kind of a rough place around this time, but like Tulsa Jesus Freak is kind of embarrassing.
Not a not a high point, no. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Like, Lana has messy records for sure, but this is the only one where it doesn't feel as though that mess is in service of something greater, or a core part of the identity in a way that I can appreciate. It just feels like, this is a collection of songs. Some of them I really like, some of them don't move the needle for me much at all, and some of them I just have no desire to hear. I think my appreciation for it has grown. Like, while it's not a standout, I really appreciate the vocal performance on songs like Not All Who Wander Are Lost, and Breaking Up Slowly is given a nice boost by Nikki Lane's feature as well. And like I said, I do really like the first two songs, Dark Were Just a Game and especially Yosemite. But I feel like, this is the only record where it's like I just pick songs I want to listen to, and I have no real desire to experience it as an album.
The best way I can relay my thoughts on this album is that when I went through her records on Rate Your Music, I went, wait, I've heard this? And discovered that I did indeed listen to this when it came out and forgot everything about it. And unfortunately, that just, it's a really disappointing moment too, because, at this point, I had just re-listened to Norman fucking Rockwell and I was like, hell yes, I'm ready. I am ready to embrace new era Lana stuff. And you know what? I bet this stuff is really underrated. And you know what? If I finally, I will stop playing devil's advocate in this conversation on the next record. But with here, I was just like, okay, it probably had to do with the fact that I was only informed by what I had heard previously of Lana, and I didn't think much of it, but it was a long time ago. I'm ready to give this another shot. And honestly, like, I do not disagree with you two at all, and I still think I like the record almost significantly less. I alluded earlier to saying that there was an album that I respected less than Lust for Life, even though I think Lust for Life is her weakest effort, and that is most certainly this. And even then, trying to decide between these two is different, just because it's like, Lust for Life for me is my least favorite purely because of that length. It's purely because of how bloated it is. In every other respect, I think that album is better than this, because again, you even like look at it and you see that it's 45 minutes long. And for as much of a continuing problem as Lana's albums have had with being bloated, I do get the appeal of being kind of submerged in her sound in a very cinematic length of time. And I get that. And on her best projects, I think that's an advantageous thing. However, it really does tell you a lot about the record that it isn't that long, because that is sort of indicative of its lacklusterness. Like, even songs that, you guys said were like, I really am not into White Dress, frankly. Like, it just doesn't work for me. I like in theory what Lana's doing with her vocals, but the kind of whispery high register she keeps hitting gets a bit grating to me. The lyricism's okay, but like the instrumentation comes off as just so confused here. The percussion is way too scattered to maintain this kind of smooth jazz vibe, and the electronic elements feel smothered out by everything else. It just feels really disorganized and strange. It's kind of admirable, but it's just sort of a mild failure for me. And even the title track just kind of baffles me, because the Antonov production here feels very limp. I just think about how, and I know that this is a direct attempt to pivot away from Norman fucking Rockwell to, do the understated follow-up. And I respect that in theory, but I think about how colorful and purposeful and subtle NFR was. And this just kind of feels like it's attempting to be the Ultraviolence to Norman fucking Rockwell's Born to Die, but the dedication to the spacey sound is just, it's not there. The lyricism is just kind of scattered imagery and signifiers that are somewhat evocative of a time and place, but it feels very sedentary. And like, again, the lyrics on Tulsa Jesus Freak are not even my least favorite part. My least favorite part here is that this is just something I'm becoming way more aware of, is that I really, really hate subtle auto-tune on otherwise great singers' voices. And it is so slight here, but I hate it. Like, it's so faintly detectable, but it makes this vocal performance on Tulsa Jesus Freak feel like listening to plastic, and it makes me feel like ugh, and I do not care to listen to it at all. But there are moments here that I do think are all right. I think Wild at Heart is a really strong ballad. Honestly, that's my favorite song on here. Pretty confidently also. Dark but just a game and not a holy wonder or lost are all right. Breaking Up Slowly doesn't really do much for me, and I'll admit I think Dance Till We Die is a real fucking dud. The jazz pastiche instrumental on here, it's kind of gross. Like, I love whenever she goes into jazzier shit, and it makes me be like, Lana, fucking commit already and make a Sophistopop album. I'm begging you. You would be so good at it. But here, it's about as appealing as like a fucking laxative. Like, no, thank you. And yeah, For Free has Wise Blood on it. That was rather nice. But this is an album that I struggle to find really anything meaningful about its connective tissue whatsoever, and it just minor Lana is the best way to put it. I again, if you ask me which one I wanted to listen to between this and Lust for Life, I would probably say this, but again, it's literally only because it's shorter.
Well, this, I think it would be a great point to say as well, that if anyone watching has an opinion which veers from us on this record, please let us know. Like,
Yes.
I particularly want to say this whenever we're unified in negativity, because it's like, I want to hear, I like when there's diversity of perspective, and it is, a shame that we are kind of all piling on this. Understandably, like, I think it just is Lana at her weakest, but like I said, there's stuff I enjoy about it. It just lacks the creative sweep, the arc, the sense of purpose that basically all of her other music has. But look, it's kind of hard to be all that mad about it existing when it was followed up so quickly by Blue Banisters. Now, interesting bit of context for this album, Lana deliberately chose not to promote it. And in a lot of senses, she described it, and although she did this retrospectively in actually quite a recent interview with Rolling Stone, she said this was an album she kind of made specifically to address her critics, and not necessarily music critics, but a lot of the people who had been saying particularly negative things about her. And this is something that's been in the periphery that we haven't necessarily talked a lot about, but has certainly been boiling and swelling a lot in the years leading up to this particular period. Lana was subject to a lot of, frankly, abuse and discourse and a lot of sort of ugliness that was directed at her, from stuff as completely just childish and ancillary as comments about her having gained weight, and all kinds of stuff about, all of a sudden she said some things that people didn't like the way she said them, or people didn't like what she was saying. And all of a sudden it was like, okay, now we have an excuse to get out all our other petty grievances about her and just join the dog pile, basically. So Lana was subject to a lot of criticism, some of it maybe fair, but a lot of it very much overblown and personal in a way that felt like it was anti-artistic and very much just an excuse for people to kind of bring out that old-fashioned nastiness. I mean, Taylor Swift experienced a lot of this in the mid-2010s as well. And, it's just a lot of the time, especially when you have artists who are as frenzied in how they are beloved by a fan base, if they have a stan army, they'll often go through this. And so Blue Banisters, in a lot of ways, in terms of how Lana presented it anyway, is an album which is kind of aimed to address a lot of accusations of her being shallow. And I think parts of it do that. It's not a record that I would say is wholly focused around doing that. It's certainly an album that is somewhat fractured in the sense that a large amount of it is songs that were written a long time ago. Some of it is songs that have been leaked already. It is a bit patchwork in terms of how it's assembled. But it does have this sense of artistic identity, and it does have this sense of clarity that Chemtrails lacks. And that's another album that is essentially made up of songs that were written over a diverse period, some of which have been leaked. It was kind of a bit of a patchwork. And this is also kind of a patchwork as well, but it is a record that, for starters, it has a lot more clarity of sound and approach. No Jack Antonoff here to be found. It is a record that has a much broader sonic palette. And it is also a record where Lana is able to, having found this new assertiveness, this new sense of clarity and confidence in herself as an artistic personality, is able to do things that are a little bit more bold, that are a little bit more new for who she is, that again recontextualize and reposition a lot of her tropes in new lights. And honestly, to me, this is just a classic sort of destined to be forgotten kind of, stuck between larger works, artistic piece. It is a singer-songwriter album that was easy to overlook, and Lana, again, deliberately didn't promote it. So there's no wonder a lot of people kind of didn't really even notice it happening. But it is one of those things that, because of that lack of frenzied focus, it is so easy to approach it for what it is, to have no context whatsoever, and to appreciate Lana doing something that is purely artistic and purely personal. And the personal is an important thing to emphasize here, because this is really the first time where Lana, well, not the first time, but like it is a significant shift in Lana's autobiographical approach in terms of writing. Like with this record, and especially with the new one, Lana is writing in a way that is very clearly about her life in the present moment. This is she evokes, the COVID era in a couple of lines here and there on certain songs here, but this feels like Lana talking about, almost diaristically, like what she is experiencing, how she is feeling, her current state of mind, on her relationships, and on the place that she is at in this particular juncture of her life in her 30s. And if you appreciate, and if you're looking to Lana as an artist rather than as a pop star or as a kind of immediate thrills musician, this is a record with a lot of juice to it. It doesn't always work. It is patchwork in its own way. And I do think that it kind of falls into a slump a little bit at the final stretch. Some of the least interesting ideas kind of clustering around there. But there is so much about this that represents Lana at her most exciting and interesting as an artist, as a songwriter.
Before I get into the larger record, I want to point out that the song "Dealer" is fucking weird. I love that song. It is that's maybe my favorite song on the whole thing. But man, that song is fucking weird.
That song was a meme. Like Lana's vocal in that song was a meme. I remember, like when this came out, like people were just like pointing, like, what is she doing? And it was like, and you either saw the vision or you didn't.
She's fucking hollering on this song, like, holy shit.
What's interesting about that song and Thunder is that they were both songs that were originally written for a collaborative record that Lana was making with the Last Shadow Puppets in 2017 that never saw the light of day. That's why Miles Kane is on this song, doing the vocals on the song. He's from the Last Shadow Puppets, along with James Ford and Alex Turner. And they were going to make a record together, and it never really panned out. And these two songs are from those sessions. They are very distinct, and they really stand out. And there's a lot of moments on this record that stand out in that way.
Also, before I forget it, Wildflower Wildfire is produced by Mike Dean. It is produced by Michael Dean.
And which is so funny, because like getting that maximalist hip hop producer on to make what is one of her most personal and even ugly songs about her family is a really interesting choice. I want to just start by talking about, to highlight Textbook. It is the opening track. It is just a perfect entering into Lana's singer-songwriter space. It's very insular. It has sort of certain tropes that relate to things she's sung about before, and ways in which she's talked about relationships and connections and romance, but it all feels very kind of seasoned with age and with this new perspective that she's adopting.
The gang vocals on the second half are fucking gorgeous.
And then you get the title track, which is my favorite Lana Del Rey song, period.
Amazing song.
This song, I've listened to this song. I'll be honest, I only heard this album for the first time like 3 days ago, because it was the last one I got to in prepping for this that I hadn't already heard. And in those 3 days, I have listened to this song, I do not know how many times. This song is like, Lana has showstoppers, plenty of them throughout her discography, but very few songs affect me the way that this does. We've said those cliched words so many times already, quintessential Lana, but I truly believe this is as close to a quintessential Lana Del Rey song as there possibly can be, particularly in terms of like the personality, the archetypes, the tropes, the things that Lana is talking about, the person that she is, and the lyrics on this song. It is just gut-wrenching. Like it's not even like an overtly sad song. There's sadness in it, there's melancholy in it, but there's, you know, optimism, there's longing, there's this sense of preservation and this sense of growth and this sense of triumph through sadness and the adversity of pain and suffering within relationships. There's the sense of unity and support from her fellow women, her friends as well, and the presence of supportive women has become very slowly but very crucially a more, you know, present part of her songwriting and her albums as well, as forecasted by the album cover of Chemtrails.
Of Chemtrails, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
so having supportive women in her life and having those important friendships has become a more present part of the way she writes, and that's such a core part of this song as well. And I don't have any, you know, massive, you know, potent, dense analysis to apply to this. I just think it's a perfect song, and it moves me to tears basically every time that I listen to it. It is one of Lana's greatest vocal performances as well. She really stretches her voice here in ways that just floor me, and finds a way of distilling the longing, the sense of what she needs, the sense of what makes her whole, of what makes her who she is, what makes her feel loved, what makes her feel supported, and the sense of tragedy that she's experienced in her relationships and in her life, but also the sense of healing that is so symbiotic with that tragedy for her now that she's had a chance to grow up and actually experience healing. It's insane. It's perfect. It's just stunning. And it is a credit to the album that it does not completely overshadow the rest of it for me. I mean, I think Arcadia is a brilliant Lana Del Rey song as well. Just a completely perfect, you know, it's like she told her fans when it came out, listen to this like you listen to video games. And she's like trying to deliberately create a dynamic where it was like, compare this and this version of my archetypical vision of Americana and of, you know, the wonder of the environment that I live in, and you know, all the things that I romanticize, compare this version of that to my old version of that and see how I've changed. And again, there's a sense of place to Lana's music more than ever as well. I mean, she had the song California on Norman fucking Rockwell, and obviously LA and California and all that kind of thing has been this overhanging setting for her music, but it is transformed from what it was in the early period of Lana's career as this just another part of the fabric of Americana that she's idolizing, to now being just this intrinsic part of her personal identity and her history. It's not just the symbol anymore. LA, California, Arcadia specifically in the song are parts of her, are like, you know, they run through her blood. And so they have more depth and more meaning, and they're not just symbolic anymore. Although Arcadia is, and its roads are talked about metaphorically in this song. But yeah, and that flows into the new record as well. But yeah. So there's loads on this record to appreciate in terms of Lana flexing her songwriting muscles as well. I want to shout out Black Bathing Suit, which is the biggest grower on the record for me, and a song I learned to appreciate more as well when I realized that this is really her deliberately addressing the people who have been commenting, you know, facetiously and quite cruelly on her weight as well, using that idea of the black bathing suit as a, you know, a kind of fuck you to the people who, you know, were pointing and laughing at her having gained weight, and just kind of celebrating her beauty and her image and the way that she presents herself. And I love that song now. I was kind of mixed on it when I first heard the album, but I've come to really appreciate what it is contextually in terms of Lana both addressing the shit that she's had hurled at her, but also just making this assertive song about, you know, I don't want to use too many buzzwordy terms, but just this assertive song about body positivity and about self-love that feels really like it has this additional weight to it. I love that. There are songs on this record that have, you know, been decried as lesser Lana, and I kind of get that, but I want to stand up for Beautiful, which has these, again, beautiful like piano frills that I absolutely love. Dealer's already been talked about. Thunder, I think, is S tier Lana, frankly. I adore this song.
That one specifically has been growing on me in recent weeks. I'm coming back to this record, I revisited that one. I was like, damn, this song, because this record at large, I do like it. It's just not one I revisit too often for whatever reason. But like coming back to it, I was like, damn, some of these songs are incredible. And you know, I completely forget about them. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those records, again, because of how low-key it was in its presentation. It's easy to forget it exists. It's easy to forget how good it is. And it's very easy to go back and kind of be a little bit bowled over by it. It's not perfect, but it is for what it is, which is an album essentially assembled from various incomplete songs, or songs that had leaked, or songs that had no place on previous records, and kind of just all sort of congealing together into this state of the nation, not state of the nation, but like state of Lana address, basically, makes it, really compelling in terms of her artistic trajectory. And if you're interested in her as a personality, really essential, I think. Jake, what are your thoughts on this one?
I'm glad I can finally come to bat for a Lana album I can consider deeply underrated, because I had no expectations for this, because once again, like, I at least heard people talk about Chemtrails when it came out. Like, I saw people mention it. I completely forgot that this album was released. I didn't ever see anyone mention it, and I just assumed it was the other Lana album that was released in 2021 post Norman fucking Rockwell, and I assumed that it was an album. And so color me surprised when I listened to this, and yeah, it does have its moments of inconsistency, but it does kind of have like it sort of embodies a black sheep favorite record of hers, of mine, I guess, and that I do just love the high points on here. And for being a piecemeal assembled record, it never feels like that. I think that a lot of it is just that there's so much more muscle to everything here than there was in comparison to Chemtrails when it comes to the production, when it comes to Lana's vocals, and I mean, especially Lana's vocals. This has her best vocal performances across the whole thing, in my opinion. They are powerful. They are loud. I mean, Riley put it best when talking about the title track on here, which again is my favorite song on here as well. One of my favorite Lana songs in general. Again, it's like riveting, honestly, like listening to this. And even in its lesser moments, she is still fully committed as a performer in a way that she just hasn't been up until this point. I really commend that. It could be something that could really, she could just sort of let her voice be more of a vibe in her sort of production style. And again, that production, I think it's a little bit more than that. I think it's more fundamental about the way that this album sounds, and that being, of course, the fact that indie rock legend John Congleton engineered this thing. The quality of everything on here is astonishingly good. I love the way everything sounds on here when it comes to the subtle synths. A lot of the guitars on here, a lot of the pianos, they sound fucking great. Textbook is a great opener. Blue Banisters is awesome. I like Arcadia a lot. I can't get over the fact that this song lyrically uses the exact same metaphor in places as Body Like a Back Road, and I just have to live with that. It sucks, it's terrible, and I hate it.
At least it's from the opposite gender. At least it's someone saying my body is like a back road instead of some guy being like,
It is a fundamental improvement in many ways, but once I heard it first, I was just like,
I will say I love this song. To me, the funniest lyric on it is "Run your hands over me like a Land Rover." Like that to me is
yeah,
like what I get what she's saying, like, and the connection she's drawing there, but it's just kind of really funny thing to say.
It is. And you know what? I appreciate it. I know we don't like to harp too much on interludes, but I just have to mention how fucking weird the trio is. And that you get the great run of songs of Textbook, Blue Banisters, and Arcadia. And then you get the fucking Ennio Morricone trap shit of this. And I'm just like, what the shit is going on, man?
What in the Quentin Tarantino is this?
I mean, you listen to it and it's like this like weird atmospheric thing, and then like halfway through, beat drop, weirdest hi-hats of all time.
It's so loud. It's so loud.
It's very strange, and I'll admit this is where the record kind of becomes like it's at its weakest point to me. I'm not really into Black Bathing Suit, I'll admit. Like, this is kind of a song for me that just sort of works until it doesn't. I just sort of feel like the hook just feels kind of a bit languid, and the second half just feels like an instrumental mess to me. It's an interesting mess, albeit, so I at least like it for that reason. But man, I'm really not into If You Lie Down With Me. Like, there's something weird going on with the fucking guitar in this song. There's an acoustic guitar in this song, and like, you cannot hear the guitar tone. You just hear the sound of whoever is playing it, their fingers strumming against the actual strings, but there's no tone that's created from it at all. And I'm just kind of like, that's very odd. But then like it's odd, but it's just a very standard song. The horns at the end just kind of feel like they happened because the song ran out of ideas, so it's just kind of like, just put these there. It regains a bit with Beautiful and Violets for Roses. I really like those two. Again, Dealer and Thunder is a great 1-2 punch as well. It does Wildflower, Wildfire, Nectar of the Gods, and Living Legend, I think, are a bit autopilot, albeit still good songs. But I really like Cherry Blossom and Sweet Carolina ending the record. Honestly, I think it's a pretty solid point at which the album comes to a close. And no, it's not the most consistent. Yes, it's definitely assembled piecemeal, and the idea of Lana Del Rey addressing her critics in an album sounds like it could be the most insufferable experience of all time. But I think she goes about it really tactfully and interestingly. I mean, one of the best things about Blue Banisters, the title track, is that, like, not to sound like, feminist blog writer about it, but like, it's kind of refreshing to hear Lana sing about two women having a conversation. That's just not really something that's been in her music
Lana
before.
passes the Bechdel test.
Not trying to go overboard on that, but I'm just saying it signifies her kind of expanding her songwriting storybook, I guess. And I feel like that's elaborated upon in the next record as well.
Well, yeah, here's the thing. I disagree on Wildfire feeling autopilot, but I understand where you're coming from. To me, like, along with Blue Banisters, that's the most like striking song lyrically on the record, and I think that the arrangement supports that beautifully. Lana is talking more and more about her family. I mean, this is a song that specifically addresses her parents in ways that are very direct. I mean, talking about, my father never stepped in when his wife would rage at me, so I ended up awkward but sweet. Like, that's the kind of directness and like obviously autobiographical shit that Lana would seldom do up until this point. So it really stands.
Lyrically, it's pretty great. I just don't really care for the instrumental that much.
And on the subsequent songs, I think Lana actually, like, it's interesting, like, they don't do much for me on this record, but like songs like Nectar of the Gods, Cherry Blossom, and Sweet Carolina, like, they kind of set up things that the next album's going to talk about. Like, both of these songs allude to Lana as someone who has this obvious romantic attachment to various aspects of femininity, one of them being motherhood, and kind of looking at the idea of motherhood. And of course, these songs being about Lana's sister, Chuck Grant, who gave birth to a daughter who's called something Phoenix. That's right, because she makes the joke about the Phoenix being named after the iPhone 11 because Phoenix is an anagram of iPhone XI, whatever.
Jesus.
That's a kind of funny line, actually, in Sweet Carolina.
Yeah.
But anyway, so she's kind of at the very tail end here. She kind of introduces these ideas of like pondering motherhood, which kind of come very nicely off of some of the commentary on Lana's family life and on where she's come from. And she's talked about her dad in a lot of songs, and he's a very influential figure in her life. So yeah, it's kind of setting up some interesting themes that she'll talk a little bit more about on the next album. But overall, it's way better than I think it has any right to be, given the nature of its construction. There are baffling decisions. The trio is just, it's like, I'm so just confused. I'm too confused by it to even be angry at it, even though I hate it. It's so bewildering. Because like Arcadia and Black Bathing Suit back to back actually complement each other really well. I mean, they're both songs about where Lana is either directly or indirectly talking about her body and her relationship to it, which makes it even weirder to see.
I mean, this is an idea directly off of Lust for Life, and it's just planted here in the middle of this singer-songwriter album, and you're like, what?
I feel like it's a kind of in-joke that I feel like must have some kind of significance to her that we'll just never know, and that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Thunder is such a stunning song because in a lot of ways it's like, it's kind of calls back to this earlier era of Lana, this kind of like devil may care, like walking into the storm, like willing to embrace being hurt, this ultraviolet era sort of thing. But it has this kind of sense of almost like underlying strength that whatever, just do it, just do what you want, hurt me. I can tell that you are not good for me anymore. And I can tell you're going to hurt me. Go ahead and do it because I'm strong enough to survive it. That's what the song is. And that's like such a contrast from Ultraviolence, where it's like, hurt me because you're going to, and it's inevitable, and I'm going to suffer and my life is suffering. Whereas here it's like, hurt me because I know you're going to, but also because I know I can take it and I know that I can come out stronger. And that's just such a moment of artistic growth for her that I love.
Because I think more so than most artists, she has a very linear progression. She never stays in one zone for too long in terms of albums. Like there's a very clear trajectory from Born to Die, Ultraviolence to this that I think is very rewarding. It's very rewarding to when you're doing a full discography listen to go from stuff like Ultraviolence to something like this where or stuff like Mariner's Apartment Complex, where she's very much assertive of her own person.
Well, that's why I think like us talking about Lana's records in this context is the best way to do it, better than just doing a review of any individual record, because you get a better sense of everything that has fed into the exact moment where something exists. And it is the best way to appreciate it. And Lana is
she
a career
benefits
artist.
from context way more than people give her credit for, I think.
Well, like she's a career artist. Like she's like Bob Dylan or Kanye or whoever you want to talk about, all the great musical artists.
Yes.
Where they build bodies of work that are interrelated.
Kanye's blonde and gone.
Yeah. Which is like that's like one of the coldest things anyone said about him. And it's so cold because it's like just tossed off. If she had written, put more into that line or said more, it would have less of an effect than just saying he's blonde and gone. Anyway, so that brings us to the present day. This is the 2-3 hour preamble essentially for us to finally review the new Lana Del Rey album. Did you know that there's a tunnel under Ocean Blvd? And like many of her,
infuriatingly without a question mark.
Right? That's the only thing I don't like about the title is the fact that there's no question mark. I think that Lana's a kind of artist who, of course, I'm surprised she hasn't done a full sentence title thing before because it makes so much sense and is meaningful when you get into the album. But anyway, like all the big Lana records, this was the end point of a rollout, and it was this real cold creative artistic statement that was happening. We were experiencing it in real time, particularly with the release of I think it was A&W was the lead single, right? It was the very first.
No, the lead single was the title track. She announced the album with the title track, but then A&W was right after.
Yeah, well, which, and this is not even really spoiling much because I love this album, but those are my two favorite songs on it. They're just like perfect, pure, distilled Lana in very different ways. So this is the latest artistic statement from Lana Del Rey, befitting the fact that we've just been through a period of records that are a little bit more kind of patchwork, that are assembled in a little bit more of an unconventional fashion, drawing together more disparate things. This is a much more conceptually and thematically unified statement. And it seems obvious, but it is sort of akin to how Norman fucking Rockwell was a much more, conceptually unified and singularly focused record. And while that record was the kind of culmination of a searching period for Lana and realizing this and crystallizing this artistic identity that distilled all of her thematic strengths with a renewed and exciting musical focus, this is Lana kind of the culmination of that post Norman fucking Rockwell period of Lana really going inward and talking a little bit more about her own life autobiographically, her own feelings. And this is kind of like, in its own way, a sort of masterpiece of internal self-examination and of commentary on where Lana is at a very creatively, interesting part of her life, which is, her late 30s. And this is a stunning album, frankly. I knew I had high expectations for it and it met those expectations. It has certain limitations, but they aren't anything that I'm not used to dealing with from Lana, which is to say, there are a few creative decisions I don't 100% agree with, but they are forgivable for reasons I'll get into. This I don't want to dominate too much early on here. I mean, what do you guys think of this new record from Lana, especially coming off the back of these conversations we've had about these other records? I mean, Coffee, why don't you go first?
It's probably my favorite album of the year so far. Probably. It's I think every actual song on here, and I say song because the goddamn priest interlude is a conversation for for a little bit, but I think every single song on here besides the closing song, which is strange to say the least, but I think A&W is the statement of Lana's career right now. That is one of her most essential songs. in terms of understanding her.
Mhm.
I love the features. The features on this album are placed beautifully.
Mhm.
With Bleachers is a little bit weird on Margaret because I'm not sure I love Jack Antonoff's voice, but besides that, I love all the features on here. Father John Misty especially. I think his voice blends in with Lana's beautifully on that song. Just
A
completely.
combination so great you wonder why it took this long.
Well, this is the thing.
Actually, Lana covered one of the songs on Father John Misty's last album as part of like an EP he dropped. Buddy's Rendezvous
That sounds
off the last
about
Father
right.
John Misty album. She did a cover of it. It's a pretty good cover.
Oh,
Yeah,
It's a pretty good cover.
It's a great cover.
that's the best song on there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Well,
But yeah, no, I love this album. I think it's very consistent. It's long as hell, title and like lengthwise, but
Need that fucking Family
and-
Guy fucking iPhone meme, like, album long as hell.
no, but Peppers, I'll get into it later, but Peppers is a weird song.
yeah,
Peppers is so weird.
Well, here's the thing about Lana at this juncture. Here's the thing about what I appreciate about Lana is that I appreciate, I mean, all my favorite Lana Del Rey records, I guess except for Born to Die, but that just feels like so different and distinct from everything else that it's in its own thing. But every other, in terms of the rest of her career, I tend to enjoy her records the most when they're at their most languorous and long and kind of just indulgent, basically. Like Lust for Life, Norman fucking Rockwell, and Did You Know There's a Tunnel are my favorite albums of hers post Born to Die, because that's, again, I love that album, but it's very in its own thing. I love Lana when she's throwing everything at the wall, particularly because she has such great instincts. And even when she does a song like Peppers, which I think is probably the worst song she's ever put on an album, I appreciate the sheer nerve of it. Even if
How much of it is just because of the Red Hot Chili Peppers mention?
Well, that's funny because I heard that the first time and I was like, oh my God, Jake and I are going to get so much out of that lyric alone. Just that's
Hook
just
is
such
so
a
nonsensical. That hook makes no sense.
well, yeah,
It
okay,
really doesn't.
if we're okay, fine. If we're gonna get Peppers out of the way now, let's get Peppers out of the way now. The Tommy
Yeah.
Genesis feature, I have nothing against Tommy Genesis. I've liked some of their music in the past, and particularly they've done features for Charlie XCX that I've really enjoyed. No universe in which they fit on this song. Everything about this song is a
No.
clash. Everything about this song is one musical idea next to another musical idea that doesn't work. I don't get it at all. Again, and there's something about the sheer nerve of that I appreciate coming from Lana. I mean, here's the thing. I think the only thing that would disappoint me with Lana at this point is if she put out a solid 40-minute album. Because I'd be like, cool, but I kind of love Lana the most when I get to have these albums that feel like whole worlds I get lost in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's things she does on this record that are seriously like bold, even for her. Like the song Fingertips, right? Which, if you don't already know, is just a series of voice memos that Lana recorded, fragments of things that she recorded and gave to her producer to form into something musical, right? It is like an avant-garde piece in a certain sense, It's been made very musical.
It really works.
It's been made to come together beautifully, but it is essentially just like Lana doing something completely off the cuff and not really with any compositional regard. And if you listen to it with that framework, you can hear how kind of just non-conventional its construction is, and how her vocals and her vocal patterns don't really fit into any kind of pattern, but that is something that she makes work through sheer force of will. A&W is, I think, it is one of the great Lana Del Rey songs. This song, I can't get enough of it. The first day it dropped, I remember hearing it like, holy fuck, Lana has never made a song like this before. It is.
You and I were both like, holy shit, dude.
Yeah,
it is the state, again, it's the state of Lana address, where she is at, how, again, the whole history of the way that she's written and the way she's been viewed, everything is filtering into this commentary on who she is now and where she's at. And then just the way that melds into this kind of like playful mocking, essentially, of this archetypical male figure who's acting childish and maybe represents sort of everything that she's come to disdain and hold in disregard for, the simplicity of the people who don't understand her, often men, often in relationships, but not exclusively. Like the way that she talks about how she has been characterized and gives it this entirely new framing and then turns it into something that is, fun and subversive and funky and weird. It's just so it's like Venus Bitch, right? It's the same kind of, the feeling I got listening to this for the first time was the same feeling I got hearing Venus Bitch for the first time, which is like, there's nothing off limits, it's perfectly Lana. Everything about it makes sense, but everything about it feels new. And that just still blows me away completely.
There's a line on A&W that completely just cuts me deep every time, and it's look at my hair, look at the length of it and the shape of my body. If I told you that I was raped, do you think that anybody would think I didn't ask for it?
Yeah.
That line just cuts me every time.
Yeah, and like I think as well,
That's
like
brutal.
Lana has this incredibly good songwriting instinct. Like, she the couplet that opens the song, I haven't done a cartwheel since I was 9. I haven't seen my mother in a long, long time. Like, there's so much that, first of all, that's just literally speaking, like a great couplet, like a really striking image, but also tells you so much as well. Like that opening line, I haven't done a cartwheel since I was 9. What an evocative and effective and devastating way of kind of giving you a whole history of essentially the sexualization that Lana has experienced ever since she was a child. The fact that she can't do a cartwheel because she'll be glared at, she'll be sexualized, she'll be seen in this way. This very simple way of expressing oneself. It's just not even expressing oneself, just this thing that women can't do, right? And it's not labored in any way. You pick out the subtext from the line, and then the way that it's contrasted with this idea of her having not had this grounding feminine presence in her life that has, again, made her even more distant from and having a weirder relationship with her own femininity. Like, there's so much. There's a whole thesis about Lana in those 2 lines. And then the next segment, which is exactly the lyrics that you said, Coffee, as well, like gives you a more direct examination of that same thing of like, okay, this is how you view me. How do you think I view myself? And what do you think I think? And it's, and she all then distills it back into that refrain of this is the experience of being an American whore. Like, it is just, let's strip the facade, right? And let's just be honest about what this is. And the song is just stunning in every fucking possible way. And if you don't like, not that anyone has been having any hot takes about this, but I'm just saying, if you don't like the slow transition and then the trap drop and the very cheeky subversive shift in the lyrical approach, you just don't understand it.
Boo.
You just don't get it, because it's perfect.
Boo.
It is like Lana giving you this brutal, serious address and then basically making fun of you for the rest of the song. And it's just so perfect.
It's not a perfect analog, but the moment it reminded me of is when Billie Eilish did the same thing in Bad Guy at the very end, when that song has that really fucking sinister drop at the end. And you're just like, what the hell? Where'd this come from?
Yeah.
It's the exact same kind of musical experience, and it's cool as hell.
Yeah, I mean, like, just to backstep as well, I think the album that song is kind of like the climax of the first run of the album, which is just some of my favorite songs Lana's ever written. The grants and the title track which go kind of together to me because they're both about similar subject matter. Again, Lana contextualizing her life. And I mean, in the past, she's contextualized herself in the context of American culture and all these things that, that she sees herself as belonging to. And here it's a context that is much more intimate, that is much more close to Lana personally, talking about, I mean, she alludes to the death of her grandmother on the song, like talking about her last, the smile on her face as she died. Lana, more than ever, has a relationship with mortality, which is an interesting thing to provoke and an interesting thing to think about and an interesting commentary, which is, it kind of goes back to Born to Die, right? Because Born to Die, we didn't really talk about this aspect of it, but one of the things that influenced Lana then was just Lana was kind of fascinated with the dynamics between, like, the life and death, basically, like the glorious and the pitiful and all these kind of extremes, right? And she evoked that really strong language on Born to Die. We're talking about, as her emotions being as serious as, fucking life or death, right? And here it's like we're talking about mortality in a very different context now, where Lana is, her relationship with death is kind of, by her experiences with losing family members, has been given this new gravity. It's this other full circle moment that just, I absolutely love. And, just at the scale and the size of the way these songs sound is just completely all encompassing. The title track is stunning. One of my absolute favorite Lana songs ever, and again, talked about the way in which Lana evokes ideas of motherhood as well, and this sense of this deep love she has for her niece on Sweet Carolina, and talking about that, how that kind of, and the implicit understanding there, how that's kind of evoking the fact that, you know, she's at a certain stage in her life and she's gone through a lot of boyfriends and she's had a lot of difficulty finding stability. And so, you know, that all just kind of crumples into this emotional outburst on this song. When's it going to be my turn, right? When's it going to be my turn? When am I going to get this sense of closure and clarity and happiness and, you know, this thing that I want, that everyone around me has that I don't have. When you go through Lana's records and you get to this point and you know the weight of all she's experienced and the instability of her life, it's just, I shed a tear the first time I heard this song when she was singing When's It Gonna Be My Turn, because I fucking felt that.
I think the stretch of Paris, Texas, Grandfather, Let the Light In, and Margaret is one of her best runs, I think, ever. I think that is a gorgeous stretch of music.
Jake, I want to hear from you about your, you know, overall feelings on the record and where it excels most for you.
Well, if not for the kind of pure alchemy and lightning of a bottle nature of Norman fucking Rockwell, this would be my favorite album she's released. And even because of it having some problems like the aforementioned Peppers, and also the fact that I find a lot of the sequencing choices on this album to be very awkward, which does not help its very long pace, like the two interludes that neither of which really do that much for me or do much to immerse me in the album's world, are basically right next to each other. And the fact that Peppers has a song before it that does exactly what it does much better than it. Like, I actually really dig Fishtail for all of its weirdness. I can get into it, is all I'm saying. Not exactly a point where, like, I'm not too into Taco Truck VB as the closer, but and I'm not sure how you would end an album like this, but it's just it's a very odd way to have the final leg of the album go out. That said, holy fuck, is the vast majority of this just absolutely incredible. Paris, Texas is my favorite song on here and one of the best songs she's ever made. It's basically an aimless story of her drifting from place to place, just unable to find anything worthy of connection to root herself there. And she just kind of goes and goes and goes. And each time it's like a fucking it just rips my heart out every time she just talks about finding nothing to be able to stay for. It's fucking just like the movie. Amazing. And it sounds beautiful.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's a perfect analog to the movie.
She's every time she evokes like a movie or a bit of like American like cinema or whatever, she's usually pretty on point. And I think this is no better showcase than right here. And I also want to showcase one of my favorite songs on here, which is Kintsugi. I think this song is fucking incredible. It breaks my fucking heart. And you know what? I even though the fucking is this the song with the Leonard Cohen reference? I can't actually remember.
I think it is.
God, like the third time this one Leonard Cohen quote has been used in albums I've heard from this year. But still, she manages to hone it in a way that doesn't actually directly quote him, and this song being a distillation of that idea is fucking incredible. It's kind of a revisit of some ideas that were on Norman fucking Rockwell, particularly the closer, just the idea of letting yourself be open to vulnerability so you can accept the best parts of life. And that being a sort of just a moment on this album as a whole just makes it all the more effective feeling. That's why I think that song, like, yeah, honestly, Kintsugi through Margaret is just an unbelievably fantastic run of songs. And of course, the Grants, the title track, and Sweet, I adore. A&W is just as great as it was made out to be. And Candy Necklace is kind of a minor effort on the record, but I still think it's pretty great. I just kind of like the swing to it. It's really nice. It's just one of those relatively poppier songs on here that I think is, just enjoyable. I like the vibe of. And again, Fingertips, an amazing song just put together out of these piecemeal voice memos that just manages to feel really fucking poignant. This record is a bit of a mess, and that's the thing, is that it epitomizes all the ways an album can be a mess and still be incredibly endearing regardless. Like, I really, really love this, I'm still nowhere near quite done with it yet, though. Even with like the stuff that I've rated particularly highly of hers, I still think I'm kind of lowballing, just because these albums I feel like are proper experiences that you really do have to sit with. It's just that because that final leg of the album does feel so relatively kind of limp, that it just does that. That's the only kind of thing that sort of blocks me for like really having enthusiasm to come back, because it's just, again, the runtime is both a blessing and a curse here. Is that I want to be like whole hog for the idea of just being immersed in like the 70-minute long album experience. She just needs to hit that level of consistency that she did with Norman fucking Rockwell again, and she gets damn close on here, and I respect the admirable attempts. I also love the Father John Misty vocal feature. It's fantastic. So
yeah, so
that's probably my favorite song on here besides A&W, is the Father John Misty one.
So we've talked a lot about, which songs we like, superficial aspects of the record. I want to dig a little bit more into some of like what Lana is doing with this album at this point as well, because I've kind of already alluded to it a little bit. Lana kind of introduces the idea of like where she's at in her life, confronting her mortality and the grants, and then of course she goes into that in more detail in Kintsugi. In fact, the level of detail in that song, to which she's sort of talking about how being confronted with the death of people intimately closest to her has really forced her to recontextualize, what her priorities are and the way that she thinks about her life. And of course, the analog there to the need for her to achieve, this ability to settle down and have a child. Like you can tell it's subtext the whole time. You can tell she really wants to have a child. She really wants to be able to find this sense of comfort and settlement that has eluded her entire life.
It's pretty blatant text in the latter half of the album. She brings it up a couple times.
Yeah. And it is also something that contextually this is made a little bit more uplifting by the fact that she recently got engaged. So she has seemingly found that person who is hopefully going to stay there and be that kind of lingering part of her life. But yeah, it's just this sense with which Lana is longing and doing so in a way that is more direct, more open, more outward than she ever has before, really makes me connect to this album on an intimate and personal level. And it's not just that aspect of her life. Like Lana really, I think, is painting this portrait of basically every facet of where her life is at. And this is where I think that the the controversial Judah Smith interlude is at the very least interesting, even if it doesn't work for you. I think there's obviously, and most critics have already drawn attention to this, but there's the key line in this sermon from Judah Smith, who is the sort of celebrity LA preacher that a lot of celebrities, go to, essentially, including Lana. But he says, at the very end, he says, you're not going to like this, but I'm going to tell you the truth. I've discovered my preaching is mostly about me, as opposed to being about, whatever he's preaching about. And that is a very telling line. Obviously, that's an analog to the way that Lana writes. Like Lana has written throughout her career about, these archetypical aspects of Americana and these very sort of almost stereotypical aspects of relationship dynamics and all that kind of stuff. And here is Lana like really just kind of highlighting the fact that that part of who she is basically over, and now she's really pulling back the curtain. I think that's the point of the interlude, and I don't love it, but it doesn't take me as much out of the experience as it does for other people.
It's not like the trio where it like makes no sense.
Yeah,
like it's weird, but it has a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a reason why it's there.
I prefer it to the John Batiste interlude, which feels like, and I don't dislike that either, because it's kind of just like a Candy Necklace's postscript. Essentially, it's almost like, they left the mics on after they finished the song and they're just grooving in the studio.
Yeah.
It has less substance to it than the Judah Smith interlude, I think. But that whole stretch, I was surprised, given the nature of it, how little it took me out of the mode and the vibe of the record. It felt like a very flowing, continuous experience. Yeah, I mean, you guys have already shouted out some of the other songs that are particularly substantive here as well. I mean, the Father John Misty song, above and beyond just being a great song, where their voices meld beautifully, is like, again, this crystallization of this stage that Lana has been moving towards, this confidence to let the light in more senses than one, not just like allow yourself to be happy, but just allow whatever is outside to happen to you. Just be able to submit yourself to the waves of life, essentially, and be content with that, not be afraid of it.
And she's still kind of like subtly cucking him throughout this track. Like he's just like, "Hey, come on, like let me in," and then she's like, "I don't know about that." It's a really nice interplay that they have. It showcases a dynamic that she hasn't really showcased before.
Absolutely, and Margaret is a total standout for me. And actually, I wasn't huge on it the first time I heard it, but it's come to be one of my favorites on the album. The Jack Antonoff feature I could take or leave, although I will say that I kind of like it purely because his specific vocal tone reminds me of Dan Beckner from Wolf Parade, which is just a personal thing. When he says that one line where he's like, "Run away like your head's on fire," he sounds so much like Dan from Wolf Parade. Anyway, the song is amazing, even if it is a song about Margaret Qualley, who is Jack Antonoff's fiance. And it's a song essentially.
I can't believe I didn't put that together.
Yeah, it's a song that Lana said she wrote for Margaret and Jack to play at their wedding. And listening to it,
very cute.
It really feels like a late night at the wedding song, like one of the last songs of the night where you're literally just there's like fucking 6 people left, and you're just.
She even drops the date of the wedding in the song.
Oh,
December 18th. December 18th, I think, is the date she drops in the song.
Yeah, it's like, again, that's that level of detail and straight from the gate autobiographical directness that defines this era of Lana. Like, she's doing
me and
that
the boys
shit
going to
ever.
crash Jack Antonoff's wedding.
And yeah, and it's like, it just really captivates me and moves me. I do think that, I'm going to just say it, I think that this should have been where the album ended. And I think that, I like some of the things that Fishtail does. It's just not really up to snuff of the rest of the record for me. Peppers, I've already spoken about. I can't stand it. Taco Truck X VB. Why am I saying times
VB? Lana doing math.
That is, I like that it exists. I think there's some cool things that happen there musically. I think the trap stuff is really well integrated, and it's a nice way of hearing Venice Pitch in a new light. But it's a curio, right? It doesn't feel like it belongs on the album itself.
It should be a bonus track.
In fact, I kind of feel like you can kind of view the last 3 songs as kind of like, just imagine this is the deluxe edition, and those are the bonus tracks.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think Margaret would have been a perfect closer. Like, it just has that whole sense of finality to it that I love.
I like that better.
But, I don't really hold that against the record, because it wouldn't be a Lana record, really, if you didn't have these moments of pure indulgence and there's something about the fact that it's so autobiographical, the fact that it has this off the cuff feeling, even if it is all very rehearsed or whatever. She creates a sensation that so much of it is improvised, and that all of the warts and weird digressions and decisions she makes fit under the umbrella of that improvisation. And so it has this sense of imperfection, this sense of like messiness that, even more than Lust for Life, you feel like you're in the studio with Lana. I think that may be the point of the John Batiste interlude to a certain extent, right? There's a sense in which Lana wants to
feel more confident.
And Lana wants to create this experience where you feel as though you're in this, and you're a part of, you're immersed in the creation of the record, and in Lana's particular state of mind, state of being, And I think it's quite telling of how revelatory this album is for Lana, of how like stripping away any sense of artifice this is, that, originally the cover art for this was going to be a fucking nude photo of her. And she eventually got, too nervous to go through with that. And she, and it's quite sad actually, because her statement was, "I changed my mind because I thought that people would think I was just seeking attention," which, speaks to a lot of the way that she's been treated.
Fair enough.
But that whole thing is, I think, another little detail that shows you like how revealing Lana considers this to be. And it is, I love when artists are around long enough to make albums like this that are so personal, so direct about their lives, doing shit like dropping wedding dates and names and all this kind of stuff, and having it have this weight and meaning that's accrued through getting to know the artist. Like, it really feels as though this benefits from knowing who Lana has been, having this investment in her as a creative force, and now getting this, pulling back the curtain. And there's less artifice and less drama and less fakeness and less pretending than there ever has been on any Lana record, even Blue Banisters. This is the pure, distilled, personal, intimate album that just makes so much sense and is so satisfying to get. and particularly to end the arc of our conversation on as well. Like to go from Lana at her most superficial, at her most like purely constructed out of images with Born to Die, completely here to the absolute inverse of that, which is pure naked intimacy. And I love that. I love that Lana has gotten to a place where she's comfortable doing that. So that brings us to the present day with Lana Del Rey. That is Lana Del Rey's 8, again, officially released major label studio albums. That gives you an idea of our perspective on all of them. We didn't go into minute detail with all of them for the sake of time, but let us know if there's anything we didn't mention or anything that we didn't talk about enough or emphasize or didn't know. Let us know in the comments below. I want to hear your additional perspectives. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Both of those things help us out a lot. If you want to go above and beyond and support us directly for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to and talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Pepsi, come alive.